I remember the smell before I remember anything else. It wasn't strong, not like a fresh hospital, not sharp or clean. It was faint, like something that used to be sterile but had been left alone for too long. A quiet smell, the kind that settles into walls and doesn't leave. That was the first thing I noticed when I stepped into the building. It was my first night on the job. New uniform, stiff shoes, badge still shining like it meant something. I had taken the job because it was simple, night guard, easy hours, good pay. No real work, they said. Just walk the halls, check the doors, keep a log. Nothing complicated. The hospital had been closed for years. That's what I was told. Most of it anyway, the man in the office said earlier that evening. He didn't look at me much when he talked, just kept flipping through papers like he was trying to find something that wasn't there. You'll be assigned to Ward C tonight. Temporary coverage. I remember asking him what Ward C was. He paused for a second, just a second. Then he said, "Old wing, not in use." That was it. He handed me a key card, a flashlight, and a clipboard with a few printed sheets. Basic instructions, patrol route, checkpoints, times. Everything looked normal on paper. It didn't feel normal once I got there. The main entrance lights were still on when I arrived, but they were dim, yellowed, like they hadn't been replaced in a long time. The lobby was quiet, too quiet for a place that still had electricity running through it. I stood there for a moment, just listening. Nothing. No voices, no machines, no distant movement. Just the soft hum of something electrical, somewhere far above me. I signed in at the desk like I was told. The pen barely worked. I had to press hard just to leave my name. Kashif Rashid. The ink looked thin, weak, like it didn't want to stay. I picked up my flashlight, even though the lights were technically on. Something about the space made me feel like I would need it. The hallway leading to Ward C was off to the left. A long stretch of polished floor, reflecting the ceiling lights in broken, uneven lines. Some of the lights flickered, not fast, just slow enough to notice. I started walking. My footsteps echoed more than they should have. The place was too empty. Every sound felt like it stayed in the air a little longer than normal. There were signs along the walls, directions to departments that no longer existed, pediatrics, radiology, intensive care. Most of the doors were closed. Some were slightly open, just enough to show darkness inside. I didn't look in. I kept walking. At the end of the hall, there was a set of double doors, metal, with small wired glass windows. One of them had a faded sign taped to it. Ward C, authorized access only. The tape was old, peeling at the edges. I stopped there. For a moment, I just stood still, looking at my reflection in the glass. It was faint, distorted by the wire inside the window. My face didn't look right. The lines didn't match up properly. I told myself it was just the glass. I reached into my pocket and took out the key card. The reader was mounted on the wall beside the door. A small red light blinked slowly. I hesitated. I don't know why. It was just a door, just another part of the job. But something about it felt separate, like everything behind it belonged to a different place, not just a different wing. A different time. I slid the card through the reader. The light turned green. There was a soft click. The door unlocked. The sound echoed down the hallway behind me. I pushed the door open. The air changed immediately. It was colder inside. Not freezing, just enough to notice. Enough that I felt it on my hands, on my face, like stepping into a room where a window had been left open all day. The lights were on in here too, but they were dimmer. Some of them buzzed quietly, like they were struggling to stay lit. Ward C looked intact. That was the strange part. I had expected dust, decay, broken equipment, signs that no one had been here in years. But the floor was clean. The walls were still painted, pale green, slightly faded but not ruined. The doors to the patient rooms were all closed, each one marked with a number. It didn't look abandoned. It looked paused, like everything had just stopped one day and never started again. I stepped inside and let the door close behind me. The click sounded louder this time. I turned around for a second just to look at it. The handle, the lock, the small window. Everything looked normal. Still, I made a note of it in my head. Just in case. I started my first round. The clipboard listed the checkpoints. Hallway intersections, supply rooms, nurse station. Simple things, just to make sure everything was secure. The nurse station was at the center of the ward, a circular desk with old monitors and empty chairs. Papers were still stacked neatly on one side. A pen rested on top of them, exactly parallel to the edge. I walked past it slowly. There was a computer screen on the desk. It was off, but not completely dark. There was a faint glow, like it had been shut down recently. I leaned in slightly. For a second, I thought I saw something on the screen. A reflection, maybe, or a shape. But when I looked closer, it was just my own face. Distorted again. I stepped back. Just a job, I whispered to myself. My voice sounded strange in the space. Too soft, but also too clear, like the room was holding on to it. I moved on. The first few rooms were empty. I checked them one by one, opening the doors just enough to shine my flashlight inside. Beds made. Sheets pulled tight. No dust. No signs of use. It was the same in every room. Until I reached room 307. The door was already open. Just a few inches. I stopped in front of it. I was sure I hadn't passed any open doors before this. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing. No sound from inside. Just that same low electrical hum from somewhere far away. I placed my hand on the door and pushed it open slowly. The hinges didn't creak. The room looked like the others at first glance. Bed, cabinet, small window with the blinds drawn halfway. But something felt different. I stepped inside. The air felt colder here. Not by much, just enough to make me notice again. I moved the flashlight across the bed. The sheets weren't smooth. They were slightly wrinkled, like someone had been sitting there. Recently, I felt a small tightness in my chest. Probably maintenance, I said quietly. Someone checked it earlier. The words didn't convince me. I walked closer to the bed. There was an IV stand beside it, a bag hanging from the top. It was empty, but the tube was still attached. It ran down toward the bed, disappearing beneath the blanket. I stared at it. For a moment, I thought about pulling the blanket back. Just to check. Just to make sure there was nothing there. But I didn't move. Something in me said not to. I don't know why. I just stood there looking at the shape of the bed, the slight dip in the mattress, the faint outline of where something could have been. Or still was. I took a step back. Then another. I turned toward the door. As I reached for it, I noticed something on the wall beside the bed. A chart, clipped neatly in place. I hadn't seen any charts in the other rooms. I hesitated. Then I stepped closer to read it. The paper was clean, newer than everything else. There was a name written at the top, but the handwriting was off, uneven, like it had been written slowly, carefully. I leaned in. The name looked like it had been written over something else, like the original had been scratched out. I squinted, trying to make it out. And then I felt it. Not a sound, not a movement, just a feeling, like someone was standing behind me, close enough that I should be able to hear them breathe. I froze. My eyes stayed on the paper, but I wasn't reading anymore. I was listening, waiting. The room was completely silent, but the feeling didn't go away. It stayed there, heavy, patient, like it had been there long before I walked in. And it wasn't planning to leave. I didn't turn around right away. I just stood there, staring at the chart on the wall, pretending to read it. My eyes moved over the lines, but nothing made sense. The letters looked uneven, like they didn't belong together. Behind me, the feeling stayed. Still quiet, close. I told myself it was just my mind reacting to the silence. That's what happens when a place is too empty. Your brain tries to fill the space. It creates something where there is nothing. I had heard that before. I held on to that thought. Slowly, I stepped to the side, giving myself a clear path to the door. My hand found the edge of it without me looking. The cold metal grounded me a little. Then, without rushing, I turned. The room was empty, exactly as I had left it. The bed, the cabinet, the IV stand. Nothing had moved. No one was standing there. The space behind me was just space. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Just nerves, I whispered. My voice sounded softer this time, like it didn't want to travel too far. I stepped out into the hallway and pulled the door closed behind me. I didn't slam it. I didn't rush. I just closed it gently, listening to the quiet click as it shut. For a moment, I stood there, looking at the number on the door. I made a note of it on my clipboard. The pen scratched lightly against the paper. That sound felt normal, familiar. It helped. I moved on. The next few rooms were the same as before, clean, still, empty. But I found myself checking them more carefully now. Looking at the corners, listening before I stepped inside. Every small detail felt important. I reached the end of the hall and turned back toward the nurse station. The lights above me flickered once, then settled again into that soft, uneven glow. I told myself I would finish the round and then take a break, sit at the station for a while, let my mind settle. That sounded reasonable. Something steady. As I walked, I glanced at the room numbers. 301, 302, 303. Everything in order. Everything normal. Until I saw it. Room 312. The door was closed, but the light underneath it was on. A thin strip of pale yellow spilled out across the floor. I stopped walking. For a second, I just stared at it. I was sure the rooms were empty. I had checked most of them already, and even if I hadn't reached this one yet, there shouldn't be any reason for the light to be on. Not in a place like this. Not in a wing that wasn't supposed to be active. I looked down at my clipboard. 312 was listed as one of the checkpoints. Check room status, it said. No extra notes. No warnings. Just another task. I stepped closer. My footsteps felt louder again, even though I was moving slowly. The sound of my shoes against the floor seemed to stretch out, echoing faintly behind me. I stopped just in front of the door. The light underneath flickered slightly. Not like a bulb failing. More like something moving inside. I leaned in a little, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then something very soft. A sound I almost missed. Breathing. Slow, even. Like someone resting. My chest tightened again. I stayed very still. Listening. Yes, it was there. A quiet inhale. A pause. Then an exhale. Too steady to be imagined. I stepped back. No, I said under my breath. That's not possible. This wing was closed. That's what I was told. No patients, no staff. No one. I looked at the handle. It was slightly worn, like it had been used many times before. More than the others, maybe. I wasn't sure. I reached out and touched it. It was warm. Not hot. Just not cold. I pulled my hand back immediately. That didn't make sense. Everything else in this place felt untouched, still, cool from being unused. But this. I looked over my shoulder back down the hallway. It was empty. The nurse station sat in the distance, silent and still. No one to ask. No one to confirm what I was hearing. I swallowed slowly. Just check, I told myself. That's the job. My hand hovered near the handle again. I hesitated. Then I pushed the door open. It moved easily. No resistance. No sound. The room inside was brighter than the hallway. The overhead light was fully on, casting a pale, steady glow across everything. And there on the bed, someone was lying there. I froze in the doorway. For a moment, I didn't step inside. I just stood there, trying to understand what I was seeing. The figure was covered by a blanket up to the chest. The head rested on the pillow, turned slightly toward the window. I could see the side of their face. Still, calm, eyes closed, breathing, slow and steady, exactly like the sound I had heard. My mind struggled to catch up. There was no movement in the rest of the room, no machines running, no monitors, just the bed, the cabinet, the same setup as the other rooms, except this one was occupied. "Hello," I said softly. My voice felt too loud, even though I barely spoke. The figure didn't respond. The breathing continued. I stepped inside. Each step felt careful, like I was entering a place I wasn't supposed to be. "Sir," I tried again, "are you okay?" Still nothing. No reaction. No change in the breathing. I moved closer to the bed. The person looked normal. Not injured, not distressed. Just resting. Their skin looked pale in the overhead light. Their hair was slightly messy, like they had been lying there for a while. I glanced around the room. No personal items. No bags. No clothes. Nothing to suggest someone had been admitted recently. Just the bed. And the person in it. I looked toward the wall, searching for a chart like the one in room 307. There was one, clipped neatly beside the bed. I stepped over and picked it up. The paper felt fresh, smooth. Too new for this place. At the top there was a name. I read it once. Then again. It didn't mean anything to me. No memory, no recognition. Just a name. Below it there were basic details. Age, gender, admission date. The date made me pause. It was from 2 days ago. I stared at it. That wasn't possible. No one was supposed to be admitted here. Not now, not recently. I flipped the page. Blank. No notes, no doctor's signature, no treatment plan. Nothing. Just a name and a date. I lowered the chart slowly. "Excuse me," I said, a little louder this time. The person on the bed didn't move. I stepped closer, standing beside them now. Their breathing was still steady. Calm. Peaceful. I leaned in slightly, trying to see their face more clearly. Something about it felt off. Not wrong. Just unfamiliar in a way I couldn't explain. Like I was looking at someone I should recognize, but didn't. I frowned. "Can you hear me?" I asked. For a second, nothing changed. Then, their eyes opened. Slowly. Not suddenly, not sharply. Just gently. Like someone waking up from a deep sleep. But they didn't look at me. Their gaze stayed fixed on the ceiling. Unfocused. Empty. I felt a chill move through me. "Are you okay?" I asked again. This time their lips moved. Barely. A whisper, so soft I almost didn't catch it. "I've been here a long time." The words settled into the room. Heavy. I swallowed. "Do you know your name?" I asked. A pause. Then just as softly. "They didn't write it down." I looked back at the chart in my hand. The name was right there. Clear. Dark ink. I looked at them again. "You're in room 312, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you remember how you got here?" Another pause. Their eyes didn't move. Their breathing stayed the same. "I wasn't brought here," they whispered. My chest tightened. "Then how?" "They forgot me." The words came out slowly. Calm. Like they had said them many times before. I felt something shift inside me. A quiet discomfort. A sense that something wasn't lining up. I looked back at the chart one more time. The name. The date. The blank pages. Then I did what I should have done earlier. I checked my clipboard. I flipped through the printed sheets, scanning the room list. 301 302, 303. I kept going. 309, 310 311. I stopped. 312 wasn't there. I checked again. More carefully this time. Ran my finger down the list. It went from 311 straight to 313. I felt the air in the room change. Not physically, just in my head, like something had quietly slipped out of place. I looked up at the bed. The person was still there, still breathing, still staring at the ceiling. I took a slow step back. Then another. "I'll be right back," I said. They didn't respond. I reached the door and stepped into the hallway. The light from the room stretched out behind me, long and thin across the floor. I turned back for one last look. The door was still open. The figure was still on the bed. Exactly as before. I pulled the door closed. Gently. The click sounded louder than it should have. I stood there, staring at the number. My hand tightened around the clipboard. I didn't write anything down. I just stood there listening, waiting, hoping to hear something that would make sense. But the hallway stayed quiet. And behind the door, I could still hear the breathing. I didn't go back to the nurse station right away. I stood in the hallway for a long time, just holding the clipboard and staring at the closed door of room 312. My ears stayed fixed on that one sound. Breathing. Slow, even patient. It didn't change. It didn't stop. And that made it worse. I told myself I needed to report it. That was the logical step. Go back, use the phone, call someone higher up, ask questions, get confirmation. But I didn't move. Something about leaving that door behind me felt wrong. Like if I turned away, even for a moment, something inside would change. Or disappear. Or notice. I don't know how long I stood there. Time felt thin in that hallway, like it wasn't moving the way it should. Eventually, I forced myself to take a step back. Then another. The breathing faded slowly as I moved away. Not because it stopped, but because distance pulled it out of reach. I kept walking. Past 311. Past 310. Each door looked the same again. Closed, quiet, empty. But it didn't feel the same anymore. Now I knew at least one of them wasn't empty. And worse, it wasn't supposed to exist. I reached the nurse station and set the clipboard down. My hands felt colder than before, slightly stiff, like I had been holding something too tightly for too long. I looked at the phone on the desk. Old beige plastic, the cord coiled neatly beside it. I picked up the receiver. Silence. No dial tone. I pressed the buttons anyway. Nothing. No sound, no response. I placed it back down slowly. "That's fine," I whispered. "Just finish the round." That felt safer. Stick to the routine. Keep moving. Don't think too much. I picked up the flashlight again and continued down the opposite hallway. This side of Ward C felt slightly different. The lights were dimmer. A few of them flickered in a slow rhythm, like they were breathing in their own way. The air felt heavier here. Not colder, just thicker. I checked the first few rooms. Empty. Beds made. Everything in place. But I stopped opening the doors all the way now, just enough to look inside. I didn't want to step in again unless I had to. I reached a corner where the hallway split into two shorter corridors. A small sign on the wall pointed toward monitoring and recovery. The checklist on my clipboard mentioned a monitoring room. I followed the sign. The door was at the end of the short corridor, slightly different from the others, wider, with a narrow glass panel running down one side. The light inside was on, not flickering, steady. I paused at the door. My reflection stared back at me again in the glass, faint, warped. For a second, I thought about turning back, just skipping this part. But the checklist felt heavier in my hand now, like it was watching me too. I pushed the door open. The room inside was quiet, but not silent. There was a sound, soft repeating. Beep. A pause. Beep. A pause. I stepped inside slowly. The room was filled with equipment, old monitors lined up against the walls, some dark, some faintly glowing. Wires hung loosely, trailing across the floor and over the sides of empty beds. But one monitor was active. The sound was coming from it. Beep. I turned toward it. A hospital bed stood in the center of the room, positioned under a hanging light. The sheets were slightly disturbed, like someone had been lying there. But the bed was empty. Completely empty. Still, the monitor beside it was on. A green line moved slowly across the screen. Rising. Falling. Steady. Beep. My stomach tightened. I walked closer. Each step felt slower than the last. The wires from the monitor ran toward the bed, draped across the sheets, hanging off the side. They weren't connected to anything. Just lying there. Loose. Pointless. And yet. Beep. The line continued. Perfect rhythm. Like a heartbeat. I stood beside the bed and stared at the screen. It didn't change. Didn't skip. Didn't falter. It was tracking something. But there was nothing there. I reached out and touched one of the wires. It was warm. Not slightly warm. Fully warm. Like it had been connected to someone moments ago. I pulled my hand back slowly. "No," I whispered. My voice felt smaller in this room. Like it didn't belong. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. There had to be a reason. A hidden sensor, a backup system, something automated. Something normal. I leaned in closer to the monitor. The screen showed basic readings, heart rate, oxygen levels, numbers that changed slightly with each beat. All stable. All healthy. I felt a strange pressure in my chest. Not pain. Just awareness. Like the room was paying attention to me now. I glanced at the bed again. Empty. But the sheets. They moved. Very slightly. I froze. It wasn't a clear movement. Just a faint shift, like air passing over fabric. Or something adjusting its weight. I held my breath, The monitor didn't change. Beep. Steady. I stepped back. I need to leave, I said quietly. No response. Just the machine. Still working. Still watching something that wasn't there. I turned toward the door. And that's when I noticed the second monitor. It was darker, not fully off, just dim. I hadn't seen it when I walked in. It sat against the far wall, partially hidden behind a curtain. Something about it pulled my attention. Slowly I walked toward it. The screen flickered as I got closer. Faint lines appeared. Not as clear as the first monitor, but visible. Another heartbeat. Another rhythm. Slower. Uneven. I frowned. There was no second bed in the room. No place for another patient. And yet, the machine was running, tracking something. I reached out and pressed a button on the side. The screen brightened slightly. A name appeared at the top. My breath caught. It looked familiar, not because I knew it, but because I had just seen it. On the chart, in room 312, the same name. I stared at it. Then I looked back at the empty bed behind me. The steady monitor. The warm wires. The moving sheets. My mind tried to connect the pieces, but they didn't fit. They refused to. That's not possible, I said softly. The words didn't feel real. Behind me, the first monitor beeped again. Steady. Alive. In front of me, the second one flickered. Weaker. Fading. I took a slow step back. Then another. My eyes moved between the two screens. 2 patients. 2 heartbeats. But only one room. And no bodies. I turned and walked quickly to the door. Not running. Just faster. Like I needed distance. I stepped out into the hallway and pulled the door shut behind me. The sound of the monitor didn't follow me. The hallway swallowed it completely. I stood there breathing slowly, trying to calm the shaking in my hands. I looked down at my clipboard. The checklist. The printed names. The room numbers. Nothing had changed. No room 312. No second patient. Nothing to explain what I had just seen. I lifted my head slowly. The hallway stretched out in front of me. Silent. Still. But it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt occupied. Not in a loud way. Not in a way I could prove. Just present. Like something was moving through the space quietly. Unseen. Unrecorded. Still being watched. I glanced back toward the direction of room 312. The light under the door was still there. Faint. Waiting. And even from this distance, I could feel it. That same steady rhythm. Not through sound this time, but through something deeper. Like the building itself had a pulse. And it wasn't stopping. I was not supposed to be there alone. That's the first thing I remember thinking as I stood in front of the basement door, holding a ring of old keys that didn't feel like they belonged to me. The supervisor had handed them over without much explanation. Just a quick look, a short sentence, and then he turned away like the conversation was already finished. Power issue below ground, he said, should be simple. He didn't look at me when he said it. I remember that part clearly. People usually look at you when they give you instructions, even if it's just for a second. But he didn't. He kept his eyes on the desk, his fingers moving papers around that didn't seem important. Like he was avoiding something. Or someone. I didn't ask questions. I had only been working there for a few weeks. Maintenance jobs like this, you don't push too much. You take the task, you do the work, you leave. That's how it stays simple. So I took the keys, and I went looking for the basement. The hallway that led to it was different from the others, narrower. The lights spaced farther apart. Some of them flickered in a slow, uneven way that made the floor look like it was shifting under my feet. The walls were plain, no signs, no directions. Just a single metal door at the end. Basement access. The words were faded, like they had been written a long time ago and never touched again. I stopped a few steps away from it. Something about that door felt heavier than it should have, not physically, just in the way it sat there, quiet, closed. Like it had been waiting. I told myself it was just another part of the building. Just another job. I stepped closer. The air felt cooler near the door. Slightly damp, like the kind of air you find in places that don't get much movement. I reached for the handle. Cold metal pressed against my palm. Locked. Of course it was. I looked down at the keys. There were more than I expected. Different shapes, different sizes. Some of them looked newer. Others were worn down, edges smoothed by years of use. I tried the first one. It didn't fit. The second one slid in halfway, then stopped. The third one clicked. The sound was soft, but in that hallway, it felt louder than it should. I paused, just for a second. Then I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Not strong, just old, like dust and something damp mixed together. The kind of smell that doesn't belong to a single thing, but to time itself. The stairway beyond the door was narrow, concrete steps leading down into a darker space. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling at the top, casting a weak glow that didn't reach very far. I stepped inside. The door closed behind me with a quiet, heavy sound. I didn't like that. I turned and tested the handle. It opened easily. That helped a little. I started down the stairs. Each step echoed softly, the sound bouncing off the concrete walls and coming back to me just a moment later. My footsteps didn't feel alone. It was a strange thought. Not because I heard anything else, but because the echoes didn't fade the way I expected them to. They stayed a little longer, like the space below was holding onto them. The light from above faded quickly as I moved down. By the time I reached the middle of the stairway, I had to switch on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness in a narrow line. Dust floated in the air, drifting slowly, like it had been undisturbed for a long time. I reached the bottom. The basement stretched out in front of me. Wide, low ceiling, concrete floors and walls. Pipes ran along the ceiling, some of them wrapped in old insulation, others exposed, showing rust and age. There were rows of equipment along the walls, old electrical panels, storage shelves, things covered in thin layers of dust. But not everything. Some areas looked cleaner. Not spotless, just less forgotten. I stepped forward. The sound of my boots changed slightly on the floor. Less echo, more weight. I checked my work order. Restore power to lower circuits. No details. No diagram. Just that one line. I sighed quietly. All right, I said to myself, let's find it. My voice didn't carry far. It felt like the room absorbed it. I moved toward the nearest electrical panel. The metal door was slightly open. I pulled it the rest of the way and shined my light inside. Wires, switches, most of them were off. A few were still on. I frowned. If the basement power was out, everything should have been down. But it was. Some of the circuits were still active. I checked the labels. They were faded, hard to read. But one of them caught my eye. Intake lower. The switch was on. I touched it lightly. Warm, not hot, but recently used. I pulled my hand back. That's strange, I murmured. I looked around the basement again. Intake didn't match what I was seeing. This place looked like storage, maintenance, nothing more. No signs of patient areas. No rooms. Just open space and equipment. I moved deeper into the basement. The light from my flashlight passed over rows of metal shelves. Some held boxes, others were empty. A few had old tools scattered across them. Everything felt still, but not abandoned. That was the part that bothered me. Abandoned places feel different. They settle. This place hadn't settled. It felt like it was waiting. I walked past a row of stretchers leaning against the wall. Old ones. Metal frames, thin mattresses, straps hanging loosely off the sides. I slowed down. There were tags attached to each one. Small pieces of paper tied with string. I stepped closer and lifted one. The paper was yellowed at the edges. A date was written on it. I read it once, then again. It didn't match anything I expected. Not recent, but not old enough to be forgotten either. I checked another tag. Another date. Different, but just as strange. They didn't follow a pattern. They didn't make sense. I swallowed slowly and let the tag fall back into place. Just storage, I said quietly. Old equipment. The words didn't feel solid. I moved on. Further into the basement, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A hallway, cut into the far wall. Narrow, dark, not marked on any of the signs I had passed. I hesitated. My work order didn't mention a hallway, but the label on the panel, intake lower. I looked back toward the electrical panel, then back at the hallway. Something about it felt connected. I walked toward it. Slowly, the air changed again as I got closer. Colder, heavier, like stepping into a place where the building itself pressed down a little more. I stopped at the entrance. The darkness inside was deeper than the rest of the basement. My flashlight didn't seem to reach as far. I pointed the beam down the corridor. The walls were the same concrete, the floor slightly uneven. And along one side, doors, several of them, all closed. No windows, no labels, just numbers, faintly painted. I took a step inside, then another. My footsteps sounded different here, quieter, like the space was smaller than it looked. I stopped in front of the first door. The number was barely visible. I raised my hand and touched it. Cold, still. I listened. Nothing. No sound from inside. I moved to the next door. The same. Closed. Silent. Then the third. I paused. Something felt different. I leaned in slightly. At first I heard nothing. Then very faint. A sound. So soft I almost missed it. A slow dragging noise. Like something moving across the floor. I held my breath. The sound stopped. The silence that followed felt thicker than before. I stepped back. My flashlight trembled slightly in my hand. No, I whispered. No, that's just pipes or air, something normal. I forced myself to turn away from the door. But as I did, I noticed something at the end of the hallway. A light, very faint, a soft glow coming from beneath the last door. I stared at it. My chest tightened again. There was power down here, more than there should have been. I took a slow step forward. Then another. The light didn't flicker. It stayed steady, waiting. By the time I reached the last door, my hand felt cold again. I didn't remember when that happened. I stood there for a moment, just looking at the thin line of light beneath it, listening. This time, there was no dragging sound, no movement, just a quiet hum. Familiar, like a machine, running, working. I reached for the handle, and for a second, I hesitated, because deep down, I had the strange feeling that whatever was using power down here wasn't something that had ever been turned off. I started down the hallway slowly, flashlight in hand, feeling the air grow colder with every step. The deeper I went into the basement, the heavier it felt, like the walls themselves were pressing in just a little. The faint hum of electricity above me didn't help. It sounded almost alive, a soft vibration through the floor that I could feel under my boots. The hallway curved slightly, and that's when I saw them. Rows of stretchers, old metal wheels locked in place, rust creeping along the edges. Some had torn fabric stretched across the frames, faded to a yellowish gray. Others were bare, only the skeleton of the metal left behind. They leaned at odd angles, lined up along the walls as if they had been carefully placed, not abandoned. I stopped. The flashlight trembled slightly in my hand. There were labels, small paper tags tied to each stretcher with string curling at the edges, dates, names, written in ink that had faded to brown but still legible. Some were decades old, others I didn't understand. The dates didn't match anything in the hospital's records, at least not anything I had access to, not even the old files in the office upstairs. I knelt down to examine one of the tags. The paper felt fragile, like it could tear if I breathed on it too hard. The name was familiar, or at least it felt familiar. I couldn't place it. The date was recent, too recent. I straightened and shined the light over the other stretchers. The tags told a story that didn't exist anywhere else. Patients who had never been admitted, treatments that weren't recorded, discharges that never happened. A cold weight settled in my chest. I took another step forward. My boots echoed softly against the concrete. Each echo stretched out, almost too long, as if the hallway itself was holding onto the sound. I ran my hand along the first stretcher, metal cold under my fingers. A faint scuff mark, a scratch along the edge like something had dragged across it recently. Not enough to be certain, just enough to make me pause. I moved to the next stretcher. Another tag, another date, another name. Some of the names looked like they had been crossed out, rewritten, scribbled over. I tried to read them. The letters were uneven, shaky, almost deliberate, like someone had been careful to hide something. I swallowed slowly and stepped back. I didn't remember ever seeing this part of the basement, not in orientation maps, not in my first walkthrough, and yet here it was, preserved, silent, waiting. I moved slowly down the row, flashlight sweeping across the stretchers, tags, and rusted wheels. The air smelled metallic, old, slightly sweet, like blood mixed with dust and time. The beam of the flashlight caught a shadow at the far end of the row. I froze. Nothing moved. The shadow didn't move. But it was there. It stretched across the wall, elongated by the flickering light above. I tried to convince myself it was just the shape of a stretcher, just the angle of the beam, but my chest tightened anyway. I stepped closer, each step careful, deliberate. My flashlight illuminated the tags again. Names, dates, nothing familiar. I glanced back at the stairwell, the exit, the light from above barely visible. I kept walking forward. Another tag, another name, another date that made no sense. I tried to write them down in my notebook. My hand shook. I couldn't keep up. There were too many stretchers, too many names. I stopped in front of one that seemed different. The metal was less rusted. The fabric less torn, the tag newer, the handwriting fresh. The name on the tag made my stomach twist. I had seen it before, earlier that night, upstairs, in room 312. I swallowed. No, that wasn't possible. The dates didn't match. The patient in room 312 shouldn't exist here. And yet, there it was, staring up at me from a tag on a rusted stretcher. I moved closer. The metal was cold, but the stretcher itself seemed recent, like someone had placed it carefully, not abandoned, not forgotten. A soft scrape echoed behind me. I spun, flashlight sweeping over the hallway. Empty. Nothing. I took a slow, deliberate breath. It was just the wheels, shifting slightly in the uneven floor, just metal against concrete, nothing more. I turned back to the stretcher. The tag trembled slightly, not in the air, not with my touch on its own. My heart began to race, not fast, just a slow, creeping beat that felt like it was moving through my veins. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. The basement was cold, the air moved, old buildings creak, metal shifts, that was all. But the feeling stayed. I walked down the row. More stretchers, more dates, more names. The longer I looked, the heavier it felt. Some of the stretchers had been moved recently. I could tell by the scratches in the concrete. Straight lines, leading to a different position from the last time they had been. I hadn't been down here before. I knew that. And yet, they had been arranged like someone had expected me. I swallowed again and moved to the last stretcher. It was the smallest in the row, a child-sized frame, rusted, faded, the tag nearly torn in half. I crouched down to read it. Name, age, date, admission, discharge. None of it made sense. None of it matched anything official. I felt a soft draft on my neck, cold, a movement of air that hadn't been there before. I turned quickly, nothing. The stretchers behind me remained motionless. The shadows stretched long across the floor. I leaned forward to read the tag again. And then I noticed it. A faint mark along the side of the mattress. Not blood, not rust, just a depression, a slight indentation. As if someone had been lying there. Recently. But the bed was empty. Completely empty. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. The rows of stretchers continued past me. Endless it seemed. One after the other. Each with its own story. Each with a date that didn't exist in any record I could find. I backed away slowly, letting the flashlight sweep over them. Every tag, every frame, every rusted wheel. All lined up neatly. All waiting. All telling a story that had never been told. I swallowed. My mouth felt dry. And then I noticed the last tag in the row. It had today's date. Written in fresh ink. The name, I couldn't read it. It seemed to shimmer slightly under the beam of my flashlight. And just like that, the basement felt colder. I didn't know why. I didn't move at first. And I could feel it. The feeling of being watched, not by someone upstairs, not by anyone human, but by something patient. Waiting. For me. To see it. To notice. To know it existed. I stepped back slowly. The stretchers stayed where they were. The tags didn't move. And yet, I knew I hadn't been alone down there. The room where I found it was smaller than I expected. It smelled faintly of paper and dust, a subtle musk that lingered in the air like it had been trapped for decades. Light from my flashlight stretched across the walls, cutting through the shadows that crowded the corners. On a single metal table lay a thick, leather-bound book, its cover scuffed and cracked at the edges. I approached slowly, every step measured. My boots echoed softly on the concrete floor. I had no idea why the book drew me in, but there was a sense that it had been waiting, patient, silent, hidden until now. The binding creaked as I lifted the cover. The pages smelled old but preserved, not brittle, just waiting. The handwriting inside was tight, deliberate, each line carefully formed, with dates, names, ages, and brief notes. At first, it looked like a normal intake log, the kind I had seen upstairs in the administrative office. But as I flipped through the pages, I noticed something strange. Dates that didn't match anything in the official records. Names of patients I had never seen before, people who should have been admitted somewhere else, or not admitted at all. The entries went back decades, some written in careful ink, some in pencil that had faded into ghostly gray. I ran my fingers over the page. The words felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. Each name seemed to whisper silently, as if trying to reach me from the paper. The first few entries were ordinary enough. Patient admitted, room assigned, treatment noted. But then the pages began to change. Discharged, NA, one line said. I frowned. Another, no record of removal. And another, never discharged, status unknown. I paused. My heart began to beat slower, heavier. I read the same line twice, trying to make sense of it. People who had been admitted decades ago and had never left. Not officially, not according to any record I could find. I flipped back a few pages. Names repeated, sometimes decades apart, with no mention of discharge. A child admitted in 1973 appeared again in 1981. The age had increased, but the record implied continuous presence. Not in a room, not on a bed, just here, in the log. I swallowed. I had seen the stretchers in the basement. Rows of them, each labeled with dates and names that were never recorded officially. Could this book be connected? The thought made my chest tighten. I kept flipping pages. Every new entry felt heavier. Names, dates, notes, some written neatly, others crossed out, annotations added in margins. One line read, patient quiet, observation ongoing, do not remove from wing. Do not remove. I felt a chill travel through my spine. The handwriting looked official, deliberate. Not a note someone had scribbled for convenience. This was meant to be permanent, intentional. I noticed a series of recent entries barely a year old. New names, dates from this month, admissions that were never recorded elsewhere, discharges blank, status unknown. I realized something that made my stomach twist. These patients, they had never been discharged, not officially. They weren't missing, at least not on paper, but somehow they had disappeared, or perhaps they had never been seen outside of this log. I closed my eyes for a moment and tried to calm myself. There had to be a rational explanation. Old wings of hospitals sometimes kept separate logs. Paperwork can get lost. Mistakes happen. I opened my eyes again. The last page I had been reading had changed. I didn't touch it. I hadn't moved the book. But the handwriting on the page shimmered faintly under my flashlight beam, as though the ink had absorbed the light differently than it had before. I leaned closer. A new entry, today's date. A name I recognized. I froze. Room 312. The same patient I had seen earlier upstairs. The one with no official record. The one who had stared at the ceiling as if nothing in the hospital made sense. I traced the line with my finger. The ink was fresh, still slightly tacky. The note beside the name read, patient admitted, observation continues, no discharge scheduled. My hands began to tremble. The stretchers in the basement, the empty room upstairs, the monitors running without patients, all of it. It fit too perfectly. I turned the page carefully. More entries, more dates, more names, some repeated across decades, some with notes like, observed daily, no interaction, do not remove. Do not remove. The phrase echoed in my mind. I could almost hear it whispered by the walls themselves. I leaned back slightly, trying to make sense of it. How could so many people have been admitted and never reported missing? How could a hospital function with patients who existed only on paper or in hidden parts of the building? I flipped further. One name written in pencil caught my eye. No date, just a note. They noticed me. The words were small, cramped, uneven, desperate. I froze. I hadn't read that one aloud. I hadn't spoken it. And yet the air felt different, heavy, close, watching. I shook my head, trying to force rational thought. Maybe it was a note from a staff member decades ago, someone paranoid, imagining things. It made sense. That had to be it. I continued flipping through pages, but now my movements were slower, deliberate. Each turn of the page felt louder in the quiet basement, as if the book resented my curiosity. I found a cluster of entries from the late 1990s. Names of children, dates of admission, room numbers that no longer existed, all marked as observation ongoing. Do not remove. I felt a tight knot form in my stomach. The word observation didn't seem clinical anymore, not with the context of everything else I had seen. It was methodical, patient, quiet. I flipped to the end of the book. The final pages were blank except for one recent line, written in careful ink. Next observation scheduled. Do not disturb. I leaned back in my chair. My flashlight hovered over the page. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the building's old ventilation system, and the sound of my own heartbeat, pounding slowly in my chest. I realized I hadn't breath for a few moments. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm the tightness in my chest. Then I noticed it. A shadow in the corner of the room, long, thin, just out of reach of my flashlight. I held my breath. It didn't move, but I felt it, watching, patient, quiet. The book lay open before me. Every name, every date, every note, the entire record of people who had existed here and never left, was a silent testament. I didn't understand it, not fully, not yet. But I knew one thing. This hospital was alive in ways I couldn't explain. It kept records of those who had never been seen. It monitored, it observed, it waited. And somehow it had been waiting for me to find this logbook. I closed the book slowly. The pages didn't rustle. They didn't resist. But as I set the cover down, I felt the weight of it, the presence of it, press lightly against my chest. A reminder. Do not remove. I stood there in the basement, flashlight trembling in my hand, listening to the soft hum of the building. The air was colder now, thicker. And I knew the hospital wasn't done observing me. It never would be. I stayed in the basement longer than I should have. After closing the logbook, I didn't leave right away. Something kept me there, an uneasy pull that made my boots hesitate on the concrete floor. The air felt heavier now, thicker, like each breath I took was being measured and recorded. I turned the flashlight in slow arcs across the basement, scanning the rows of stretchers again. They were the same as before, rusted metal, frayed sheets, faded tags. But now I noticed something new. The shadows between them seemed deeper, darker, almost as if they were hiding small movements I couldn't quite see. I walked slowly past the first few stretchers, my fingers brushing along the cold metal. Nothing stirred, but the air felt aware. I wasn't alone, not in the way you might expect, not with a sound or a form, just a presence, patient, waiting. I remembered the note in the logbook. Do not disturb. I swallowed. My mouth was dry. My hands trembled slightly, gripping the flashlight. I kept telling myself it was the building, the way old concrete settles, the hum of the electrical panels, that it was just the air shifting, nothing more. But rational thoughts couldn't erase the feeling that these stretchers, these notes, these shadows, they were still watching. I moved toward the far end of the row. The smallest stretchers, child-sized, lined neatly against the wall. The tags here were newer than I expected. The ink still dark, the paper not quite aged. I leaned close, reading a name. Another date, today. I froze. The air felt colder here. My breath came out in short, visible puffs. The beam of my flashlight trembled. The tag wasn't moving, at least not visibly, but I could feel a tension around it, something almost alive. I whispered to myself, barely audible, "It's just a record, just a record." But the basement didn't answer. It just waited. I stepped back slowly, trying to keep calm. That's when I heard it. A soft, dragging sound, faint but deliberate. My flashlight's beam swung in the direction of the noise, but nothing moved. Not even a shadow. The sound stopped. I froze. And then I noticed a faint glow beneath the door I hadn't paid attention to before. It was at the far end, where the concrete walls narrowed. A small rectangle of light, orange and steady, almost like a candle had been left burning. I knew the basement. I had been down here often in training. No lights should be on in this wing. It was sealed, forgotten. Yet here it was, glowing, waiting. I approached slowly, each step careful, deliberate. The air grew colder as I drew near. Not unpleasantly so, just noticeable. More than the usual chill of an underground basement. The door handle was cold when I touched it, metal slick under my palm. I turned it slowly. The hinges creaked quietly. Inside was another small room, cramped, lined with cabinets and shelves. The glow came from a single old lamp on a metal table. Its bulb flickered faintly, steady enough to illuminate a stack of papers, clipboards, and more handwritten logs. I stepped inside cautiously. My flashlight hovered over the table. The logs were old, but the topmost one had fresh ink. Today's date, names that were unfamiliar, admissions that should not exist. I picked it up with trembling hands. The pages smelled faintly of ink and dust. I began flipping through, reading slowly, each line sinking into my mind. There were patients here in this book who had never been recorded anywhere else. No charts, no files, no monitors, no beds assigned. Just names, just dates, just notes. And beside them, instructions. Observe quietly. Do not remove. Do not interfere. I whispered, "Observe what?" The basement answered only with the hum of electricity. I realized then that the intake process had never stopped. Not really. Not in the way anyone could see. People or something were still being admitted, monitored, recorded, even now. I felt the air shift behind me. I spun, flashlight beam cutting across the walls. Nothing. Only the shadows of the stretchers beyond the door lining up silently in the dark. But the feeling didn't leave. Not the sense that someone or something was present, waiting, watching me as patiently as the records themselves. I forced myself to focus on the logs. Names, dates, room numbers, instructions. Some lines had notes scribbled in the margins, annotations that didn't make sense. Patient aware. Do not let leave. They must stay. I ran my fingers along the paper. The ink felt slightly raised, like it had just dried. I read the same lines twice, my mind trying to reject the idea that this was real. Then a sound. A soft exhale, not my own, not audible at first, just enough to make the air in my throat tighten. I held my breath, trying to listen, heart slowing in cautious rhythm. Silence. I exhaled slowly, nearly trembling. I looked back at the logs. Fresh entries, today's date, names I didn't recognize, but one stood out. The same patient from room 312. Not only recorded here, but multiple times in the past weeks. Admissions, observations, instructions. Never discharged, never missing. Simply observed. My stomach turned. I had seen the monitors upstairs, the empty beds, the warm wires, the stretchers in the basement. Now the logs confirmed it. The process never stopped, even now, even tonight. I leaned back against the wall, flashlight sweeping the room slowly. Cabinets of files lined the far walls, drawers closed tightly. Each drawer seemed to hum faintly with anticipation, as if waiting to be opened, revealing more names, more admissions, more records of the unseen. The air grew heavier still. I could feel the weight of the building pressing down, an almost tactile presence that made my boots feel anchored to the floor. I set the logbook back down carefully. Every instinct told me to leave. My mind screamed that I had seen too much, that the basement itself was alive in its own patient, deliberate way. And yet I lingered. The hum of the electrical panels, the soft vibration beneath my boots, the shadows stretching between the stretchers. It was as if the basement was whispering, reminding me that the intake process didn't need my approval, didn't need my understanding. It just continued, quietly, patiently, unseen by the world above. I thought about leaving, about climbing the stairs, stepping back into the fluorescent lights of the main hospital wing, pretending I hadn't seen the logs, the stretchers, the names that never existed officially. But the feeling of being observed grew stronger, patient, waiting. I realized that leaving wouldn't change anything. The basement, the logs, the process, it didn't care about me. It never had. The intake never stops. I swallowed, my throat was dry. My fingers trembled slightly as I brushed dust from the top of the logbook. The shadows seemed to gather in the corners, pooling softly under the stretchers and along the walls. I couldn't tell if they were moving or if it was just my imagination. And then I heard it again. Soft, deliberate, a scrape against concrete, nothing visible, just sound. I told myself it was the building, old metal shifting, old pipes settling, but the sound came closer, patient, quiet, familiar. I froze. Every name I had read in the logs, every patient who was never discharged, every shadow I had glimpsed among the stretchers, all of it pressed against my consciousness. The intake process had never stopped. It was still ongoing. Even now, I didn't know how to leave. Not really. Not without feeling that presence, that awareness, follow me all the way to the stairs and beyond. I set the flashlight on the table, letting its beam rest on the pages. The logs, fresh and old, inked and faded, seemed to hum softly under the light. I didn't touch them. I didn't need to. The intake continued, as it always had. I backed toward the door slowly, every step measured, patient, careful. The drag of my boots sounded softer here, but not gone. The shadows clung closer. I reached the stairwell and glanced down once more at the basement. The rows of stretchers, the faint glow beneath the other door, the humming, waiting air, they were all still there, still observing, still ongoing. I took a deep breath and began the climb. The basement didn't change, didn't close, didn't let go. And I knew, as I emerged into the hospital above, that the intake process was still waiting, still observing, still ongoing. And that night, every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the basement breathing quietly beneath me, patient and deliberate, keeping track of the unseen. The rain had started softly at first, a whisper against the leaves and rooftops. By the time I reached the hospital, it had turned into something heavier, a steady drumming that made every step slippery and uncertain. My backpack was soaked, clothes sticking to my skin, and the storm was relentless, wind cutting through the empty streets like a knife. I had been walking for hours, trying to find shelter, trying to get somewhere safe before the night fully claimed the sky. That's when I saw it, the hospital. Its brick exterior loomed like a forgotten sentinel at the end of the street. Broken windows, faded paint, the kind of place people avoid, the kind of place people tell stories about but never enter. But the rain was insistent. I had no choice. The front doors were locked. Of course they were. That's the first thing I noticed. But the side entrance, a rusted metal door swinging slightly on its hinges, gave me the opportunity I needed. A gentle push, and it opened with a long, hesitant creak. Inside, the air was cool, damp, and smelled of old plaster and something metallic, faint but persistent. Water dripped from the ceiling somewhere in the distance. My boots echoed softly on the tiles as I stepped inside, each footfall swallowed by the emptiness. I didn't know what I was looking for. Just somewhere to sit, somewhere to dry off, somewhere to wait out the storm. The lobby was vast, open, and silent. Dust motes floated in the flashlight beam I carried, moving lazily in the air as if they had been trapped for years. Old chairs lined the walls. Tables were overturned. Papers, yellowed and brittle, lay scattered across the floor. I moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything more than necessary. The echo of my boots seemed louder here, bouncing off the high ceiling and empty hallways. I told myself it was just the building, just the emptiness. I found a side corridor, narrower, lined with doors that were mostly closed, some hanging loosely on their hinges. I pushed open the nearest door and stepped inside. A small office, dusty and still, with a desk and a chair. Old files lay in a neat stack as though someone had left in a hurry. I ran my fingers over the desk surface. Thick dust, undisturbed. I sat down heavily, feeling the chair groan under my weight. Outside, the storm pounded relentlessly. Inside, I could hear every drop of rain, every gust of wind shaking the walls. I opened my backpack, pulled out a towel, and tried to wring out some of the water from my shirt. My fingers shook slightly, from cold, from tension, from the unease that comes with being somewhere abandoned, somewhere that might have stories I didn't want to hear. The silence pressed in around me. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't comforting. It was heavy, dense, patient. I tried to focus on something else, anything else. The storm, the rain on the roof, the distant drip of water somewhere deeper in the building. But even these ordinary sounds felt different, altered, amplified in the vast emptiness. I realized I wasn't alone, though I couldn't see anyone. I could feel it before I acknowledged it. The building had a presence, not malevolent, not yet, just aware, patient, waiting. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The office was small, but the shadows seemed to stretch and pull at the corners. The doors across the hall were just doors, but they felt like entrances to somewhere else entirely. I stood up, flashlight sweeping slowly across the corridor. No movement, nothing, just empty hallways, doors, chairs, the remnants of a place that had once been alive. But even in the emptiness, I felt it watching. I walked slowly toward the main hallway, every step careful. My boots made soft echoes that faded too quickly, as if the building swallowed them. I passed a set of double doors leading to what had been the nurse's station. The glass was cracked, some panels missing entirely. Inside, desks and counters were overturned. A forgotten coffee cup lay on the floor, moldy and damp. I shined my light across the room. There was nothing, only the quiet remnants of life, the ghosts of a daily routine frozen in time. I kept moving, past patient rooms, most with doors hanging loosely. Some were empty. Some had old mattresses, yellowed and stained. I stepped carefully, avoiding piles of papers and broken tiles. The storm outside continued to rage. I could hear the wind press against the building, whistle through broken windows. The rain bounced off the roof in irregular patterns. It was chaotic, and yet inside the silence was heavier, slower. I found a room at the far end of the corridor. The door was partially closed, hinges squeaking slightly as I pushed it open. Inside was a small ward, 4 beds, rusted frames, thin, yellowed mattresses. Dust floated above them in the flashlight beam. I sat on the edge of one bed, careful not to disturb the metal frame too much. My hands rested on my knees. I tried to breathe slowly, to calm the tightness in my chest. The storm raged outside, and still the silence inside pressed against me. I realized I could feel the building's history in the air. Every patient, every nurse, every doctor who had walked these halls seemed to leave something behind. Not a ghost, not a voice, not even a presence I could name, but an echo, a weight, a quiet insistence that the place remembered. I heard a faint scrape from down the hall. I froze. My flashlight beam swept toward the sound. Nothing, just the empty corridor. My heart thumped slowly, a measured, tense rhythm. I told myself it was the wind, the building shifting, water dripping somewhere I couldn't see, rational explanations. And yet the scrape came again, soft, deliberate. I held my breath. Nothing moved. No doors, no shadows, just the feeling of being noticed. I sank lower on the bed, hugging my knees. The storm outside, the echoes inside, and the slow, creeping awareness of the hospital itself pressed in on me. I realized then that I would have to spend the night here. There was no safe place outside in the storm. No streetlights, no awnings, no shelter but this abandoned hospital. I wrapped my jacket tighter around me and tried to settle. The bed was thin, uncomfortable, but it would have to do. I stared at the ceiling, watching dust float in the beam of my flashlight, patterns drifting lazily as if they were alive. I kept hearing it, not footsteps, not voices, just the soft, persistent feeling that I was being observed, that every creak, every whisper of wind, every subtle movement was catalogued, noted, remembered. Time passed slowly. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I tried to close my eyes, tried to sleep, tried to pretend this was just a shelter from the storm. But the building was patient. Every time I drifted, I felt it, the awareness, the waiting, the quiet insistence of the hospital itself. I remembered the signs outside, closed, do not enter. I remembered the cracked windows, the rusted doors, the layers of dust. And I realized I was not just seeking shelter. I was inside a place that had long since stopped being a hospital for the living. I didn't know what it was now. I only knew it would keep watching me, patient, deliberate, until the storm ended or perhaps longer. I drew my knees closer, flashlight beam resting on the floor. I let my mind drift to the sound of rain, the smell of damp plaster, the quiet hum of the building's pipes. I tried to let the atmosphere lull me, even as the unease coiled tight in my chest. And I understood, slowly, fully, that this night would not be ordinary, that this temporary stay was not a simple matter of waiting out the storm. The hospital had waited for me, and I had walked inside. I woke to the sound of wind rattling the broken windows, the rain still drumming against the roof. My flashlight lay beside me on the thin mattress, still glowing faintly in the dim light that seeped through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. I had tried to sleep, tried to let the storm lull me into forgetting where I was, but the building never let me rest. The silence of the hospital was different from any silence I had known. It wasn't empty. It was aware, patient, waiting. I stood slowly, brushing off the damp from my jacket. My boots echoed softly on the floor as I moved down the narrow corridor, flashlight scanning the peeling walls. That's when I noticed it, a door at the far end of the hall, one I hadn't paid attention to the night before. It was a heavy wooden door, worn and chipped, with a lock that looked solid enough to keep anyone or anything out. I remembered passing it yesterday, assuming it led to a storage closet or old utility room. But now, under the beam of my flashlight, I noticed something strange. The latch was undone. I frowned. I was certain I had locked it. The night before, I had checked every door I could find, shutting them, securing them, making sure nothing would come through. And yet this one, it was open. I approached cautiously. My hand hovered over the handle. I told myself it was the storm. The wind had to be forcing it open from somewhere, some hidden crack I hadn't seen. Rational thoughts clinging desperately. I pushed the door slowly. It swung inward silently, revealing a small room, barely larger than a closet. A table leaned against one wall, covered with dust and old medical charts. A single chair was overturned in the corner. The smell hit me immediately, musty, metallic, like old iron mixed with decay. I stepped inside, flashlight sweeping over the walls. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, and yet the door creaked softly behind me, not from the wind, not from the hinges, from somewhere else almost deliberate. I turned quickly. The door was still open. The latch had swung slightly on its own, moving in a way that suggested intention, not accident. I swallowed. I closed the door carefully, pressing the latch down until it clicked. I stepped back, holding my breath. For a moment, the room seemed silent, as though it were holding itself still, waiting to see if I would believe it. I turned away thinking I could ignore it, but a faint, almost imperceptible sound drew me back. The click of the latch, the soft, deliberate movement. I spun around. The door had swung open again, just slightly. I staggered back, flashlight shaking. My rational mind tried to catch up. "It's the building," I muttered under my breath. "It's old. The hinges are loose, that's all." But the sound was different this time. Softer, patient, knowing. I crouched down, trying to examine the latch, the hinges. Everything seemed intact. No wind could reach this far into the hall. No one had been down here but me. And yet the door continued to open, slowly, repeatedly, without human touch. I felt a cold sweat run down my back. My heart was calm, but only because it had settled into a slow, deliberate rhythm, matching the pace of the storm outside. The building, I realized, had its own heartbeat, and the door was part of it. I sat down on the floor, flashlight resting across my knees, staring at the door. It opened and closed with a faint sigh, almost like breathing. I could almost imagine it drawing air in, releasing it slowly, waiting for me to notice. I remembered the stories people tell about abandoned hospitals, about rooms that seem to shift, objects that move, shadows that watch. I had laughed at them. Not here, not tonight, not in this place. The door clicked open again. I counted them silently. 1, 2, 3, each time slightly wider, each time more deliberate. I reached for the door and tried to hold it shut. My fingers pressed against the cold metal of the latch. I pushed with all my strength. The door resisted for a moment, then swung open just a crack. I jumped back. I whispered to myself, "Stop, stop, stop." It didn't. I backed into the hall, flashlight sweeping over the walls. Shadows stretched long across the peeling paint. The storm outside had softened slightly, but inside, the building seemed to hold its own rhythm, unaffected by the weather. The door swung open one more time. I realized I could no longer count it. It didn't obey any sense of time. One moment it was closed, the next open, wide, narrow open, closed, patient, observant, waiting. I sank down against the wall, legs drawn to my chest. I watched the door swing gently, as though testing me, as though the building itself were alive and curious. The smell in the room seemed stronger now, musty, metallic, faintly sweet. I could imagine it pressing into my senses, leaving a residue in my mind, a reminder that the room was not empty, not really. I whispered again, just to fill the silence, just to make the space feel human. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just need shelter." The door didn't answer, but it didn't stop either. I looked at the table inside. Charts, papers, faded and brittle, scattered across the surface. None of it made sense. The handwriting was tight, precise, official. Yet the names, the notes, the dates, they didn't match any records I had seen. Some were decades old, some strangely recent, and a few completely unrecognizable. I realized that the room wasn't just moving. It was maintaining itself, keeping a record, waiting for someone to notice. And somehow that someone was me. I tried to leave. Every instinct screamed that I should get up, get my things, and step outside into the storm. But my legs felt heavy, anchored to the floor. My mind churned with the impossible thought. What if the door opens because it wants me to see something? What if it's guiding me, or watching me? I took a slow, deep breath, tried to steady my racing thoughts. I stepped back toward the door again, hand hovering over the latch. I held it tight, determined not to let it move. I whispered, "I won't let you in. I won't let you out. I won't." The words caught in my throat. The door swung open wider than before, and in the gap I saw it. Not a person, not exactly. A shadow darker than the dim light around it, hovering just beyond the frame, patient, waiting, unmoving yet alive. I stumbled back, my flashlight tilting across the floor. The shadow didn't move closer, but the room felt smaller, closer, as though the air itself had thickened. I realized then that the door wasn't trying to trap me. It wasn't trying to hurt me. It was reminding me. This hospital had rules. Rules that didn't make sense to the outside world. Rules about observation, patience, and attention. And I had entered without understanding. The door swung gently again. One slow, deliberate arc. And I felt it in my chest, in my lungs, in the small pulse of panic that refused to rise fully, an understanding that this place had noticed me. I could no longer hold it. I let my hands drop. I watched. Minutes passed, hours maybe. Time had no meaning here. The storm outside was distant now, a background noise. The shadow remained just beyond the doorway. The room, the door, the latch, the papers, they existed quietly, carefully, alive in their own patient way. I sat on the floor, flashlight across my knees, and I let the door move. Open, closed, open, closed. I didn't try to stop it. I didn't try to understand. I just watched. And I realized something slowly, deeply. This room would keep swinging. It would keep opening and closing long after I left, long after I was gone, long after the storm ended. The hospital didn't need me to understand. It only needed me to witness. I stayed there until the storm softened to a drizzle, listening to the soft creak of the door, the subtle movement of air, the patient rhythm of a building that had been waiting a long time. And I understood, finally, that my stay here, temporary, accidental, was already part of its history. The door swung open once more. I whispered, "I see you." It paused. Then it moved again. I couldn't sleep again. Not really. My eyes stayed half open, tracing the faint outlines of the broken window blinds, the boards that covered most of the glass, the shadows that pooled in the corners. I could hear the rain outside, softer now, a distant drumming rather than the storm's full fury, but the hospital had its own rhythm, independent of the world beyond. I had begun to feel it, a subtle pulse beneath the floorboards, the hum in the walls, the almost imperceptible shift of air around me. And the room, that room. The door, the latch, the papers, the table, all of it. I had told myself it was just a door, just an old room, just a trick of imagination and exhaustion. But when I closed my eyes, when I let my mind drift even slightly, the sensation grew. I was not observing it. It was observing me. I woke fully at some point, though I'm not sure when. I felt it first in my chest, a light pressure, as if something unseen were weighing on me just enough to make me aware of its presence. I sat up, flashlight in hand, and turned slowly toward the room. The door was slightly ajar, as if it had never been closed at all. I wanted to leave. My rational mind screamed at me to grab my backpack and run into the street, let the rain wash away the unease. But my legs refused to move. My body felt heavier, as if gravity had changed inside these walls. The door waited, patient. I whispered aloud, barely more than a breath, "I'm not here to harm you." The air didn't answer, but it shifted. I stepped closer. The floorboards groaned under my boots, echoing through the empty hall. The door seemed to tilt slightly, a subtle movement, a lean toward me that I could feel before I saw it. The beam of my flashlight flickered across the threshold. The room was empty, only papers, dust, and the faint outline of the table. And yet I could feel it. A presence, patient, quiet, watching, not just aware of me but studying, measuring, waiting. I sat down on the edge of the mattress again, trying to calm my breathing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The room didn't feel hostile, not exactly, but it wasn't neutral. It was deliberate, calculated, almost clinical in its attention. I thought about the old stories I'd heard about abandoned hospitals, the legends of rooms that seemed to move, of objects that shifted when you weren't looking, of spaces that felt alive in some subtle way. I had laughed at them once, not anymore, not tonight. I leaned back against the wall and tried to focus on something else. The soft hum of the heating pipes, the distant creak of the building settling, the irregular drip of water somewhere beyond the corridor. All ordinary sounds. But the room itself was not ordinary. I realized I was being measured, observed in ways that had nothing to do with sight or sound. I could feel the calculations in the air, the quiet attention, the deliberate patience. It wasn't waiting for me to leave. It was waiting for something else, something I didn't understand yet. I stood slowly, flashlight scanning the corners. Dust motes floated lazily in the beam. The table and papers remained still, unchanged, untouched. And yet the awareness grew. I could almost hear it in my mind, the soft insistence that I remain, that I notice, that I understand, even without knowing what to understand. I moved closer to the door, hand hovering over the latch, and tried to speak again. I don't mean anything. I'm just sheltering from the storm. The air shifted, a faint draft, but not from the broken windows. The door swung open slightly, a movement so subtle it could have been imagined. I froze. The pressure in my chest tightened, not fear exactly, but recognition. I was being observed. Not as an intruder, not as a trespasser, but as a subject, as a patient of sorts. I staggered back, flashlight beam trembling. The floorboards groaned under my weight, but the sound seemed distant, almost irrelevant. The room, the door, the table, the papers, they were patient. They did not need to rush. They only needed to wait. I sat down again, hugging my knees, trying to slow my heartbeat. I told myself it was exhaustion. The storm, hunger, cold, anything but what I felt. But even as I spoke, even as I reasoned, I could feel it watching, measuring, judging, waiting. I glanced at the papers on the table. Old charts faded and yellowed. Names, dates, instructions. Some I recognized from stories, from news clippings, from memories of old reports I had read in the past. Others were unknown, recent, impossible. I realized then that the room was not only observing me, it had been observing others before me. Not selectively, not maliciously, but meticulously, patiently. The thought settled in my chest like a weight. This place had a memory, a record, and I was part of it now. I ran my hand along the edge of the table, fingers brushing dust. The sensation was ordinary. Nothing moved beneath my touch, yet the awareness of the room intensified. The air seemed thicker, closer, pressing gently against my skin. Not aggressive, not threatening, but deliberate. I whispered again, "I see you." No reply, but the door shifted slightly. A tilt, a subtle sway, as if acknowledging my words. I realized then that I wasn't meant to control this space. I wasn't meant to command it, to make sense of it, to bend it to my will. I was to witness, to remain, to exist under its observation. Time passed slowly. Minutes stretched into hours. I tried to read the charts on the table, to distract myself with familiar tasks. Names, dates, notes in tight handwriting. Instructions for patients that no longer existed. Notes about observation, monitoring, waiting. I felt a kinship, a strange recognition with those who had come before me. They had been watched, cataloged, acknowledged, and now I was part of the sequence. I lay back on the mattress again, flashlight beam resting across my knees. The door swayed gently. Open, closed, patient, measuring, unhurried. I thought about leaving. My mind screamed that I should run, that I should escape this subtle scrutiny and the creeping unease that filled my chest. But my body remained still, anchored by exhaustion, by the unshakable sense that I was not alone, and that leaving was not a choice the room would permit me to make freely. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I could have imagined it. But the hair on the back of my neck stood up instantly. It was my name. Not spoken aloud, not from lips, from the room itself, from the air, from the awareness that surrounded me. I swallowed, my throat dry. I hear you," I whispered back. Silence, and yet I felt it, watching, waiting, evaluating. I realized fully then that the hospital, this room, the door, the air itself, had no need for my understanding. It did not require comprehension. It only required presence, awareness, witness. I closed my eyes, breathing slowly, letting my mind focus on the rhythm of the storm outside, the pulse of the building beneath me, the gentle sway of the door in the hallway, patient, constant, observing. And I understood that night more deeply than I could have imagined. I was not the traveler observing the hospital. The hospital was the traveler, and I was the temporary stop on its path. Temporary but noticed, measured, cataloged. Part of the quiet, persistent observation that had existed long before me and would continue long after I left. The rain slowed to a drizzle. The shadows deepened. The door swayed gently. And I remained, patient, deliberate, conscious of every breath, every heartbeat, every subtle shiver in my body, fully aware that the room itself had begun to count me among its records. I had entered for shelter. I would leave having been observed. And I understood, finally, that the observation would not end with my departure. The hospital had been closed for decades, or so the records said. Yet here I was, standing in front of its rusting gates, notebook in hand, flashlight tucked into my coat pocket, trying to decide if I should be frightened or simply curious. I'd spent weeks tracking the final employees on staff before the shutdown, and one name had kept drawing me back. A nurse whose last shift was logged the night the hospital closed its doors for good. Her name, printed neatly in the old employee roster, seemed to linger in every faded file I found. I pushed the creaking gate open, careful to step over the weeds and broken tiles littering the entrance path. The storm last night had left the air damp, earthy, heavy. The wind whispered faintly against the walls, carrying with it a scent of rust and decay. The hospital loomed above me like a sleeping giant, windows shattered, paint peeling, and the front doors hanging loosely on their hinges. I stepped inside. The lobby greeted me with a silence so deep it felt almost tangible. My boots echoed on the cracked tiles. Dust motes drifted in the faint sunlight filtering through the shattered windows, moving lazily in the air. I ran my fingers over the reception desk, careful not to disturb anything more than necessary. Papers lay scattered, some still clinging to their metal holders, yellowed and brittle. I had seen these records in the archives before, but now I was here, in the building itself, where history had been made and forgotten in equal measure. I opened my notebook, flipping to the page with her name. Clara Holloway, nurse, final shift, October 14th, 1987. Every entry I had found suggested she left at the end of her shift, clocked out, and vanished from the staff directory with the hospital's closure. But the more I dug, the more her name kept appearing in logs long after the official records claimed she was gone. I moved slowly down the main corridor, flashlight beams sweeping the walls. Every step seemed heavier than the last. I passed rooms with peeling wallpaper, cracked tiles, and old chairs lined against the walls. Patient rooms, offices, treatment rooms, all frozen in time. The smell of damp plaster and mold clung to my clothes. I tried to ignore it, but my chest felt tight, my stomach uneasy. I found myself drawn to the nurse's station, where the old-time cards and logbooks had once been kept. I crouched, brushing away a thick layer of dust to reveal a small metal drawer. I pulled it open and found a stack of handwritten logs, the ink faded but still legible. Page after page, names, dates, and brief notes documenting every shift. And there she was, Clara Holloway. But the entries didn't end. Weeks, months, years after the hospital officially closed, her name appeared. Written in the same tight, deliberate handwriting as before. Shifts she could not possibly have worked. Notes she could not possibly have made. I felt a chill, the kind that rises from the base of your spine and settles into your chest. The air in the room seemed thicker, almost suffocating. I turned over one log after another, tracing the entries carefully. Some notes were mundane, checking on patients, preparing charts, updating inventory. Others were different, vague observations, almost like she was watching something no one else could see. I whispered her name, as if calling her might answer the questions I couldn't articulate. Clara. Nothing. And yet I felt it. A subtle shift in the air, a sensation that the space around me was aware of my presence. The logs, the desk, the room itself, all seemed to lean inward, patient, deliberate, observing me in turn. I felt as though I had crossed some invisible threshold, entering a space where the past lingered like a living thing, and I was the intruder. I stood slowly, notebook clutched in my hand, and moved further down the hall. Each step echoed, each breath felt amplified in the empty building. I passed rooms with beds still made, chairs overturned, old medical equipment rusting quietly. The hospital was dead, and yet I could feel the imprint of life that had once filled it. Every person who had walked these halls, every patient, every nurse, every doctor, they had left traces, memories frozen in the air. I tried to focus on my task. Clara Holloway, her last shift. Why her name still appeared in the logs. I traced the dates in my notebook, comparing them to the files I had already collected. There were patterns, gaps, odd repetitions, entries that defied explanation. And then I heard it. A faint creak like the hinge of a door moving slowly. I froze, listening. The sound came from a room down the corridor, a treatment room whose door had been hanging loosely on its frame. I raised my flashlight, shining the beam toward the sound. Nothing moved. The room was empty as far as I could see. I told myself it was the building settling, the wind pressing through the broken windows. My own imagination, fueled by hours of poring over old records and walking these empty halls. I stepped closer. My boots made soft echoes. The air grew heavier with each step. My heart beat steadily, though with a slow, insistent tension. The door creaked again. I reached out, hand brushing against the frame. Cold, damp, solid, and yet alive in some way. I took a deep breath. "Clara Holloway," I whispered again. "What happened to you?" No answer, and yet I felt the presence of the room, the desk, the papers, the entire hospital itself pressing in, watching, waiting. I moved the door slowly, pushing it open just enough to step inside. Dust swirled in the beam of my flashlight. The room was empty, except for a small cabinet in the corner. I walked toward it, feeling an inexplicable hesitation with each step. There was something in the air, a weight that seemed both comforting and threatening, like the eyes of someone who had been waiting for me. I opened the cabinet. Inside were more files, stacked neatly despite decades of abandonment. I flipped through them, searching for anything with her name. And there it was, Clara Holloway again, in the margins of a patient log. A note in her handwriting. Observation completed. No further action required. Dated long after the hospital's official closure. I swallowed, the chill running down my spine stronger than before. Who was she observing? What had she been doing here that the records never mentioned? And why did it feel as though the building itself was aware I had found this note, as though it had been waiting for me to see it? I sat down heavily on the edge of a rusted bed frame, notebook in my lap. The room seemed to breathe with me, the air thick and still. I traced the letters of her name with my finger on the paper. The ink was faded but precise, deliberate. Each stroke felt purposeful, alive in a way I could not explain. I whispered again, "Clara, why are you still logged?" A cold breeze brushed across my face, though the windows were mostly sealed. I shivered. The building seemed to respond to my question, shifting slightly, the floorboards creaking softly beneath unseen weight. The sense of awareness, of patience, grew stronger. I realized then that this wasn't just an investigation. I wasn't merely uncovering history. I had stepped into a space where the past lingered, where a life, one carefully documented, one quietly observed, was still present, still attentive, still counting. I stayed there for what felt like hours, reading the logs, tracing the entries, listening to the building. The rain outside softened to a gentle drizzle, the light through the windows dimming. But the hospital remained alive in its own way, patient, deliberate, aware of me and of Clara Holloway, whose name still existed here, still mattered, still waited. Eventually, I closed the cabinet, taking care not to disturb the papers. I left the room, flashlight tracing the walls, ears attuned to every creak and sigh of the building. The lobby was quiet, the air heavy, and I felt an unshakable sense that I was being observed, not as a threat, but as a witness. I stepped outside into the fading afternoon light, notebook clutched to my chest. I felt the building behind me, patient, deliberate, alive in some way I could not define. And I understood, finally, that Clara Holloway's presence, her meticulous logging, her careful observation, had not ended with her last shift. It had continued. And now so had mine. I returned to the hospital the next day, notebook clutched tightly in my hands. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and heavy with the smell of wet concrete and rust. I moved carefully through the lobby, my boots echoing softly on the cracked tiles. Dust shifted faintly beneath my steps, though nothing else moved. Nothing, at least, that I could see. I headed straight for the nurse's station, the small cabinet where I had found Clara Holloway's logs the day before. My fingers brushed the metal drawer and I pulled it open. Inside, the stack of papers seemed unchanged, though I couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting, patient, aware. I flipped through the pages slowly. The early reports from her first few nights on staff were normal. Routine observations, notes about patients, instructions followed carefully. Her handwriting was tight and precise, each line neat and deliberate. I could imagine her moving through the hallways, quiet, methodical, efficient. She had been competent, professional. But as I moved deeper into the stack, the reports began to change. The entries grew more disjointed. Notes that once described patients' conditions now drifted into strange observations that didn't make sense. A chart that started with temperature readings and medication schedules would suddenly note a shadow in room 12, not listed in patient registry, or hallway whispers repeating numbers I do not recognize. I paused, tracing her words with my finger. My mind tried to reconcile them with logic. Exhaustion, fatigue, overactive imagination after long nights on duty, perhaps. But there was a consistency to the strangeness that unsettled me. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't exaggerating. She was observing, documenting, recording meticulously. I read on. The entries became increasingly surreal. One night she described a patient who smiles but has no face. Another detailed voices in the vents, counting slowly, patiently in languages I do not know. The handwriting remained neat, precise. No tremor, no sign of hysteria, only observation, only notes. I leaned back against the wall, notebook in my lap, trying to process it. The air felt heavier, almost humid, as though the building itself were pressing closer, listening as I read. I whispered her name almost reflexively. Clara. No answer, of course. And yet, the feeling of being observed grew stronger. Each word I read seemed to resonate beyond the page, embedding itself in the room, in the floorboards, in the very air. I noticed something else, a pattern. The further her reports drifted from reality, the more detailed they became. Not vague or hurried, but precise. Times, locations, measurements, distances, counts, descriptions of events no one else could have witnessed. I shivered. I imagined her walking these same halls decades ago, moving silently past the rooms, past the beds, past the walls that now sagged and cracked. She was alone in her shift, yes, but not alone in what she documented. Something else shared her night, something unseen, something aware. I flipped another page. Her notes had begun addressing someone or something. Phrases like "it waits patiently" or "do not disturb, observation ongoing" appeared alongside patient care notes. The juxtaposition was jarring. One moment she was charting vital signs. The next, she was noting the behavior of shadows, sounds, presences that had no name. I whispered again, this time to the air itself. What did you see? The room remained still, silent, but my skin prickled. The air shifted. A subtle movement, like a breath passing through the halls long after the storm had ended. I realized with a chill that the building had been alive in ways I had not yet understood. Clara had been writing what she saw, what she knew, what she could not explain, and now I was seeing it too. I read on, each line pulling me deeper. Her entries described the building's rhythms, its subtle movements, the almost imperceptible shift of air through the corridors. She wrote of rooms that breathed, of doors that opened and closed without cause, of the faint, patient counting of unseen presences. I could feel it in the walls as I read. A quiet attention, deliberate, like eyes that existed everywhere yet nowhere at once. I wasn't imagining it. I could feel the building watching me, waiting for me to understand what she had spent countless nights observing. And then I found a report that made my stomach tight. She had written of herself, not as a nurse, not as a human being, but as a participant, an element of the building's observation. She documented her own movements, her own heartbeat, her own breathing, as if she were both observer and observed. A strange duality. She wrote of doors moving before she reached them, of whispers that repeated her thoughts back to her, of shadows that mimicked her movements. I leaned back, breathing shallow. My flashlight trembled in my hand. The air around me thickened, and I realized I had been holding my breath. I whispered, "Clara, you were part of it." The words echoed softly against the walls. No reply, no sound beyond my own voice, yet the room seemed to pulse, as though acknowledging the truth of what I had read. She had not merely been documenting reality. She had been engaged in it, immersed, participating in a reality that no one else could see, no one else could measure. I continued through the stack. The reports grew more fragmented, sometimes almost unreadable, full of cryptic notations. It shifts when unobserved. The rooms remember. Do not leave the halls. Observation is ongoing. And always in neat handwriting, precise and patient, her name marked the bottom of each page. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The hospital itself seemed to respond. The floorboards groaned faintly, though I had not moved. The air pressed gently against my face, cool and deliberate. I imagined her walking these halls long ago, documenting, nodding, observing, and I understood that she had become part of the building's memory, a persistent presence that lingered even now, decades later. I realized I was reading more than reports. I was reading a history of observation, a record of the ways a building could hold, watch, and remember. Clara Holloway had been the final element, the human witness embedded within a structure that refused to forget. I closed the drawer carefully, not wanting to disturb anything further. My hands shook slightly. I stepped back, flashlight sweeping the corridor. Shadows stretched long across the walls. The hospital was silent, yet I felt its attention, its quiet patience. I whispered to the empty air, "I see you, Clara. I see what you saw." The faintest draft stirred, rustling the pages left behind in the drawer. A subtle acknowledgement, patient, observant. I realized that night that the building did not end with its closure. Its memory, its observation, continued through her reports, continued through her presence, and now continued through me. I stepped toward the exit slowly, notebook pressed to my chest. Each footfall echoed, yet the building seemed alive in its silence, aware of my every movement, every breath. I glanced back once, toward the nurse's station, toward the drawer of logs. I could almost feel Clara Holloway watching me through time, her presence embedded in the paper, in the ink, in the very air that surrounded me. The rain had stopped entirely now, leaving the world outside bright and ordinary. But inside, the hospital remained alive in its own patient, deliberate way. I left the room quietly, doors creaking softly behind me. My notebook, my flashlight, the logs, they were not mere objects. They were extensions of a memory that refused to fade, a record of observation that continued long after the final shift ended. And I understood fully that I had not come here merely to study history. I had come to witness it, to be observed, to become part of the same persistent record that Clara Holloway had left behind. The hospital's memory was patient, its observation unbroken, and her name was still logged. I returned to the hospital the following evening, the sky bruised purple and gray, heavy with the promise of rain. I had spent the day poring over Clara Holloway's logs, tracing her handwriting, her observations, her notes that had become increasingly strange. But tonight, I felt a compulsion to see the building for myself, to walk the hallways she had walked, to feel the air she had breathed decades ago. The lobby greeted me with the same silence, but tonight it felt different, softer, watching, patient. My boots echoed faintly against the cracked tiles, and the air carried that familiar mix of rust, mold, and old plaster. I clutched my notebook, flashlight in hand, and moved toward the nurse's station. I pulled open the drawer with the logs, and my fingers brushed against the stack of papers. Clara's handwriting stared back at me, neat, precise, familiar. But now I could feel something more, something alive in the ink itself, a pulse beneath the words, as though the notes themselves were aware I was reading them. I began with her entries from the final weeks before the hospital closed. Her reports had always been meticulous, chronicling vital signs, medications, and patient behavior. But toward the end, they changed. The first unusual note mentioned a patient who responded in whispers to questions no one asked. At the time, I had brushed it off as a misreading, a trick of fatigue. But the further I read, the stranger it became. She documented conversations. Not imagined conversations, not delusions, but real exchanges that she recorded in detail. Patients, many long deceased, answered her questions, spoke with her, offered observations. Names she never knew, memories of lives that had ended decades before. The logs were full of dialogue, questions and answers that should have been impossible. I sat cross-legged on the floor, flashlight illuminating the faded pages. I read a few entries aloud to myself. Mr. Fenton, room 4, asked for his sister. I told him she had passed. He nodded and smiled as if confirming my words. Then he asked if I had spoken to Miss Holloway. I said no. He said she had told him to be patient. I do not know what he meant, but his eyes were calm, expectant. I paused, letting the words sink in. He was dead. According to the records, he had died a year before Clara had arrived. And yet she recorded a conversation, a real exchange. The way she described his voice, his mannerisms, the subtle expressions, no note of hallucination, no tremor in the pen, only observation, only careful, patient documentation. I felt a shiver run through me. The hospital was not merely empty. It was populated by echoes, by memories that persisted beyond death. And Clara had been able to speak with them, hear them, record them. I continued, reading slowly. Room 7, Miss Aldridge. She asked if I had seen the nurse's lounge. I said yes. She corrected me on the location, though the lounge has been closed for years. She laughed softly, a sound that seemed to pass through the walls. She asked if I could see her reflection. I said no. She smiled knowingly and said it did not matter. Observation continues. I leaned back against the wall, flashlight resting across my knees. The air in the room seemed heavier, almost alive. I could feel it pressing gently against my skin, attentive, aware, patient. I realized then that Clara's role had changed over time. She was no longer just a nurse, no longer merely responsible for patients' physical care. She had become a witness to something larger, something unseen but persistent. The building itself had memory, and she had been listening, documenting, conversing with what the hospital retained. I traced the next entries carefully. They became more detailed, more deliberate. Conversations with patients who had been forgotten, who had been listed in old charts but never spoken to anyone outside these logs. Some were angry, some sad, some confused, but all were calm in her presence, as though she were a bridge between the living and the remnants of the dead. One entry chilled me. Room 12, Mr. Hargrove. I asked him if he remembered the accident. He smiled faintly and said that memory is irrelevant. He asked me if I had followed the instructions. I said yes. He nodded. I felt a presence behind me, though no one is here. I record this observation carefully. The room hums softly. It is aware of me. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the words sink in. The room hummed. The air shifted, almost imperceptibly, as though responding to the memory of what Clara had experienced. I could imagine the floors creaking beneath invisible weight, the walls holding the shape of a body long gone, the echoes of speech vibrating softly through space. I whispered aloud, not really expecting a reply. "Are you still here?" Nothing, and yet the hairs on my arm stood up. I could feel the subtle insistence of the building, patient, deliberate, acknowledging me in the way it had acknowledged her. I felt the pull of those conversations, the persistence of the voices she had documented. I turned another page. Room 3, patient unregistered. She asks if I remember her. I say yes. She asks if she is remembered by the others. I am uncertain how to answer. She smiles faintly and says that memory is enough. I am instructed to observe, document, and remain patient. The hallways shift slightly in response. I shivered again. Shift in response. Observation continues. Memory is enough. The notes were calm, matter of fact, but the implication was vast. The building, the patients, the echoes of lives long gone, all were interacting in ways beyond human understanding. Clara had been the intermediary, the observer who could record what no one else could see. I felt the weight of it settle in my chest. The hospital was not dead, not entirely. It retained voices, memories, presences, and Clara had found a way to engage with them. And now I was here, reading the words decades later, feeling the same subtle awareness pressing in from the walls, the floors, the empty rooms. I whispered again, "I hear you." The air shifted faintly, a brush against my skin as though something were acknowledging my words. Patient, deliberate, observant. I continued reading through the logs. Conversations became increasingly surreal, questions that made no sense, answers that defied logic, references to events I could not verify. But Clara never hesitated, never faltered. She documented each interaction with care, precision, patience. It was as if she had accepted a new reality, a reality where the patients who had died continued to speak, and the building itself continued to respond. I realized I could feel it too, the same subtle awareness. Not in my mind exactly, but in the space around me. The walls, the floor, the air itself seemed to vibrate faintly with the weight of memory, of observation, of conversation that refused to end. I sat back on the floor, flashlight beam resting across the pages, notebook open on my lap. I could imagine Clara walking these halls, speaking with the unseen, recording every word, every pause, every subtle shift in tone. The hospital had been alive in ways I could not have understood before, and she had been its witness, its intermediary, its voice. I read one last entry for the night. Room 9, patient smiles. I ask if the observation is complete. She nods. I feel a presence behind me. The building hums. Observation continues. I remain patient. My role is complete for now. I am both present and remembered. I closed the log carefully, careful not to disturb anything further. The air pressed gently around me, attentive, patient. I could feel the weight of all those conversations, the persistent awareness of the hospital, and the presence of Clara Holloway herself, still lingering in the ink, the paper, the walls, and the floors. I rose slowly, flashlight in hand, notebook pressed to my chest. The corridors were silent, yet not empty. Shadows shifted faintly in the corners of my vision. The building had memory, and the patients who had died were not gone. They persisted in subtle ways, and Clara had been their chronicler, their witness. As I stepped outside into the cool night, the rain beginning to fall softly once more, I realized the truth. The hospital did not forget. The patients did not leave. And Clara Holloway's records were not merely historical. They were alive, continuing to document, to observe, to preserve the echoes of voices that had long since passed from the living world. And somewhere deep in the building, I felt that observation continuing, watching, listening, patient. I had come seeking answers. I had found something far more unsettling. Something that spoke back. I returned to the hospital just as the sun was fading behind the distant hills. The sky was a muted gray, the kind of light that made everything seem slightly unreal, like a painting left out too long in the rain. I had spent the past days immersed in Clara Holloway's logs, retracing her steps, reading her conversations with the dead, following the building's quiet awareness as if it were alive. But tonight, I felt an urgency I could not name. I had to see it for myself, the evidence that suggested she had never truly left. The front doors groaned as I pushed them open. Inside, the lobby was cooler than outside, air damp and heavy with the smell of rust and decayed plaster. My boots echoed softly, but the echo felt different tonight. It lingered longer, vibrating faintly, as if the building itself were stretching to hear me. I moved directly to the nurse's station, to the drawer that held the logbooks. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, pulling out the stack of reports. Her name appeared on every single page, neat, precise, patient. Clara Holloway. Each entry carefully signed, each note meticulously dated. And then I noticed something that made my stomach tight. The timestamps. They never ended. Every night after the hospital officially closed, every week, every month, even every year, her name appeared. There were no gaps, no final clock out. Every entry, patient or not, ended with her initials, her careful signature, her acknowledgement of observation. And the notes seemed to follow a pattern, as if the act of recording itself was a task that could not cease, a rhythm that could not break. I whispered almost involuntarily, "Clara, you never left." The air shifted faintly, almost like a breath passing through the hallways. My skin prickled. The feeling of awareness, the subtle, patient observation pressed closer, as if the hospital itself had acknowledged my words. I could sense it in the walls, the floors, the air moving softly around me. I flipped through the latest entries. They were not recent, at least not in the conventional sense. The dates suggested years beyond her disappearance, decades even. Notes about patients who had long since been forgotten, conversations with shadows that had no name, observations of corridors and rooms that had been sealed for years. Every detail recorded with painstaking precision. And then I realized what it meant. She was still here. Not as a body, not as a living nurse, but as presence, as record, as observation itself. She had never clocked out. She was part of the hospital's memory, a permanent fixture in its awareness. Every room she had walked, every patient she had spoken to, every note she had written, it all persisted. And the logs were proof. I felt a chill move through me, deeper than anything I had experienced before in these halls. The building had become more than empty. It had become an organism of memory and observation, and Clara Holloway was its heartbeat. I followed the hallways slowly, flashlight illuminating cracked tiles and peeling paint. The shadows stretched long, flickering with the beam, yet I could sense movement beyond what my eyes could see. Doors that I had previously noted as shut were slightly ajar tonight, as though welcoming me, testing me, gauging my presence. I paused outside room 14, the door slightly crooked on its frame. Something made me stop. The air felt thicker here, heavier. I held my flashlight steady, fingers tightening around it. My heart beat steadily, but slow, deliberate, like a drum marking time I couldn't measure. I whispered her name again. And then I heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, like paper sliding across a desk. My flashlight beam flicked to the source, a logbook lying on a small counter inside the room. It was open, as if someone had just been reading it. The pages trembled slightly, though no one was visible. I stepped inside cautiously. The air smelled faintly of ink and dust, sharp and metallic. I leaned over the book. The entries were hers, Clara Holloway's handwriting, neat and precise. But the most recent note froze me in place. Observation ongoing. No clock out. Task persists. I remain patient, present, and attentive. Building records me as much as I record it. The words seemed to vibrate faintly, almost alive, and I realized I could feel the presence of her writing, her observation. The hospital itself was aware. The walls, the floors, the doors, they knew I was here, and so did she. I swallowed hard. My pulse thrummed in my ears. The air around me seemed to press closer, gentle but insistent, like a hand brushing against my shoulder. I shivered. I traced the ink with my fingers. Every line was deliberate, precise, patient. There was no panic, no fear, no hesitation, only observation, only the act of being present. And now I understood that her presence had not left the building when she did. She had remained permanently as part of its memory, part of its awareness. She was still working, clocked in forever. I moved slowly down the corridor, flashlight sweeping over rooms I had seen before. Each door, each window, each room seemed to acknowledge me, responding to my presence in ways I could not describe. I felt watched but not threatened, observed but not judged. The hospital was patient. It waited. And somewhere within it, Clara waited too, persistent and attentive. I paused outside the old nurse's lounge. The door creaked faintly. I remembered reading her notes about this room, observations, interactions, instructions left behind. I opened the door slowly. Dust swirled in the beam of my flashlight. Chairs lay overturned, papers scattered across the floor. But I could feel it. The presence of someone who had never left. Someone who had watched these halls, recorded them, documented them endlessly. I whispered her name again, Clara. A faint rustling answered me. Nothing visible, just the soft, deliberate presence of the building and perhaps of her. The room felt alive, not with threat, but with memory, with observation, with persistence. I could feel her work continuing here, decades later, in ways that defied explanation. I stepped back into the hallway, notebook pressed to my chest, flashlight beam steady. Each footstep echoed, but the echo felt deliberate, measured, like a pulse keeping time with hers. I could imagine her moving through the halls, recording each detail, each presence, each subtle shift in the air. She had never stopped. She had never clocked out. And now I was part of it. I left the nurse's lounge and moved toward the main corridor, taking in the patient rooms, the offices, the treatment areas. Each room carried the faintest imprint of her presence. Every bed, every chair, every corridor was marked by her attention, her careful observation. I could feel it pressing against me, patient and deliberate. I whispered once more, softly, reverently, "I see you, Clara, still working." The building seemed to answer subtly, imperceptibly. Floorboards creaked faintly, a draft brushed my skin, and I understood she was still here, clocked in forever, watching, observing, patient. I stepped outside into the cool night. The rain had begun again, a soft drizzle that made the world outside ordinary and mundane. But inside the hospital, the building remembered. The patients remembered. And Clara Holloway never left. She remained in every hallway, every room, every line of ink, a constant observer of a world that had moved on without her. And I realized, with a chill that settled into my bones, that the hospital's memory, her memory, would persist long after I left these halls tonight. And perhaps I thought quietly as I walked away, so would I. I never thought I'd find myself here, in this half-forgotten archive, sifting through boxes of old hospital records and patient files long since abandoned. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew, the low hum of the overhead lights vibrating softly in the silence. I had been asked to catalog the old files for historical purposes, a simple task, until I stumbled across a small, unmarked box tucked behind a row of metal filing cabinets. Inside was a single cassette tape. Its label was handwritten, faint and smudged, almost illegible, Children's Ward Therapy Session. I turned it over in my hands, the plastic warm from years in storage. My curiosity piqued. I wondered what might be recorded on it. A historical interview, a patient session, something else. I found an old tape player nearby, dusting off the controls. The device clicked faintly when I pressed play, and then a soft hiss filled the air, followed by a voice. A woman's voice, calm, measured, professional. She spoke slowly, gently, as though speaking to someone who could not fully understand her words. Session begins at 3:15 p.m. Patient, room 4. Observations noted, anxious, withdrawn, therapy ongoing. The voice was ordinary, mundane even, but there was a subtle tension beneath it, a careful attention to tone and phrasing, like she was aware of more than just the patient's words. I leaned back in my chair, eyes tracing the rows of cabinets, and listened. The tape continued. The therapist asked questions softly, measured, but there were pauses. Long, deliberate pauses. I could hear faint background noises. The shuffle of papers, the distant hum of fluorescent lights, perhaps the occasional creak of the old building settling. Nothing alarming, nothing overt, just presence. Then the voice of a child came through. Not loud, not clear at first. Just a whisper, almost lost beneath the hiss of the tape. I hear them, the child said, voice trembling slightly. The therapist responded gently, almost soothingly. Who do you hear? The child's voice grew more insistent. The others in the walls, they watch, they listen. I froze, the cassette trembling slightly in my hands. The sound was soft, almost hesitant but distinct. A child describing something no one should be able to hear. Something unnatural. The therapist's voice remained calm, professional, never betraying surprise. Can you describe them? She asked. Are they people you know? No, the child whispered. Just watching, waiting. Sometimes they talk back. A chill ran down my spine. The tape hissed faintly, the background hum of the player filling the room. The therapist continued, carefully guiding the child, asking questions that elicited only vague, unsettling responses. There were no screams, no panicked cries, only whispers, soft and precise, like the memory of a conversation long ago. The session progressed. The child described shadows moving along the edges of the ward, shapes that shifted when unobserved, whispers echoing in empty hallways. The therapist documented everything with quiet precision, her voice never rising, never showing alarm. She asked clarifying questions, repeated statements gently, acknowledged the child's fear without dismissing it. I leaned closer to the tape player, listening intently. The longer the tape played, the more I noticed the subtle patterns in the voices. The child's descriptions became increasingly specific. Names, movements, behaviors of figures that could not exist, presences that had no place in reality. Yet the therapist recorded them as fact, not conjecture, as if she had seen them herself, as if she too acknowledged the reality the child described. At one point the child whispered, "They say you shouldn't leave, not yet." The therapist responded softly, "We are safe here. The observation continues. Can you tell me more?" And the child spoke again, nomming details that seemed impossibly precise. Doors that opened without wind, shadows that repeated their own movement, whispers that mirrored thoughts before they were spoken. The descriptions were quiet, calm, yet each word pressed into my mind, slow and deliberate, planting images I could not forget. I realized then that this session was not ordinary therapy. It was documentation, observation. The child was speaking to something, and the therapist was recording it methodically, as if she understood the weight of what was being witnessed. The tape hissed and clicked occasionally, small interruptions, but the voices continued, weaving a narrative of subtle dread and persistent awareness. There was no screaming, no chaos, only the slow, patient acknowledgement of forces present in the hospital, unseen yet undeniable. "Do they see you?" the therapist asked quietly. "Yes," the child whispered. "Sometimes, but they wait, patient, they remember." I swallowed hard. The quiet persistence in the words, the slow, deliberate tone, made the air in the archive feel heavier, charged. I could almost sense the presence the tape described, patient and silent, observing still. The session went on. The child spoke of rooms that shifted slightly, furniture that moved without explanation, voices that repeated questions before they were asked. The therapist remained calm, guiding, documenting, providing a steady anchor in a world that had clearly stretched beyond normal perception. I leaned back in my chair, the tape playing softly in the quiet room. The voices became almost hypnotic, the therapist's measured questions, the child's soft, trembling responses. Each word, each pause, each faint sigh carried the weight of unseen observation, a slow, creeping dread that did not startle, did not scream, but lingered, pressing against the edges of thought. At one point, the child said, "They told me you would listen, that you would remember." I felt a chill run down my spine. The words felt like a direct acknowledgement of me, decades later, listening to a recording of something I should not fully understand. The tape, the voices, the hospital itself, they all seemed to stretch through time, patient, deliberate, observing. The therapist's voice continued, "I am here, I see them too, we will remember together." And in that moment, I understood the weight of what I was hearing. The hospital was not empty. The ward was not gone. The voices persisted, documented by someone who had borne witness, someone who had recorded the whispers and shadows, the patient observations, the subtle, unending presence of forces no one else acknowledged. The tape ended with a quiet click, the hiss fading to silence. I sat in the archive, breath shallow, heart still pounding softly. The room felt charged, heavy with the memory of what I had just heard. The voices lingered in my mind, patient, observing, insistent in their quiet persistence. I realized then that Clara, or the therapist, whoever she was, had left more than recordings. She had left proof that the hospital remembered, that the children's ward, its shadows, its whispers, had never truly ceased. That observation continued, patient, deliberate, across decades, across time. And now, somehow, I was part of it too. I carefully placed the tape back in its box, reverently, as though handling something alive. I stepped back, breathing slowly, letting the echoes of the session settle around me. Outside, the world continued as normal, indifferent. Inside, the ward persisted, patient, remembering, recording, waiting. And I understood, with a chill that settled into my bones, that some things never end. Some presences, some observations, continue indefinitely, quietly, patiently, beyond the bounds of time and human comprehension. And for now, I could hear them. I returned to the archive the next evening, tape in hand, my curiosity gnawing at me like a small, persistent animal. The room smelled faintly of paper and dust, the air heavy with stillness. I set the cassette into the player, hands shaking slightly. The hiss and click welcomed me back, familiar and unnervingly intimate, as though the building itself recognized my presence. The therapist's voice emerged first, calm and deliberate as if nothing had changed. Session begins at 3:15 p.m. Patient, room 4. Observation ongoing. Then the child's whisper, I hear them again. I froze, listening intently, but this time there was something different. Beneath the therapist's professional tone, beneath the child's tentative murmurs, I detected other voices, faint, fleeting, almost impossibly soft. They did not belong to the therapist. They did not belong to the child. They were whispers, half-formed words that seemed to float in the background, indistinct yet unmistakably present. I should, one voice murmured, trailing off as if interrupted. Another, do you see? You should leave. The tape hissed slightly, static filling the pauses, but I could feel the voices pressing through the hum. They were not coherent, not fully structured, but the tone carried a quiet insistence, patient and measured. It was as if these presences were responding directly to the session, observing, commenting, interacting without being acknowledged. I leaned closer, heart tightening. The child's voice remained calm but wary. They talk when no one else listens, he said softly. Yes, the therapist replied, still composed, still professional. I hear them too. They are part of our observation. Documenting their responses is crucial. I swallowed hard. My pulse was steady, but the air in the archive seemed thicker now, charged with the faint tension of unseen attention. I felt as if I had stepped into the room with them, not merely listening, but being listened to. The additional voices began to grow, not in volume, but in clarity. Words emerged from the background, fleeting and fragmented. Waiting, watching, always here. Do not forget, not yet. Patient, patient. The child shifted in the recording. They speak to me. They know my name. The therapist responded softly. They recognize all who enter. Their memory is persistent just as yours is. I pressed my hand against my chest. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight beyond comprehension. They were not threats, not warnings in the conventional sense. They were reminders of presence, observation, continuity. The building, the ward, the session itself, it all existed in layers, some human, something else entirely. The tape continued. The child described shadows shifting along the edges of the ward, corners that darkened inexplicably, and a feeling of being measured, as if the very act of being watched were part of the environment. The therapist asked questions carefully, guiding, acknowledging, documenting. And always in the background, the other voices murmured. I could almost imagine them, glimpses of presence, reflections at the edge of perception. No one spoke to the therapist directly. The child seemed to notice them, react to them, describe them, yet the therapist recorded with steady calm, never startled, never dismissive. The words they spoke were deliberate, patient, almost ritualistic. "They do not leave," the child whispered at one point. "They follow. Even when I close my eyes, they are there." The therapist replied softly, "Observation continues. Their attention is part of the environment. It is persistent, patient, deliberate." I shivered. The quiet precision of the voices, their unhurried cadence, created a slow tension that was unlike anything I had experienced. There were no loud noises, no shrill interruptions, just the constant, patient, creeping sense of being observed, acknowledged, recorded. Then a single voice, clearer than the others, cut through the background hiss. "Why are you here?" It was not the therapist. It was not the child. The words hung in the air, delicate yet deliberate. I felt my breath catch. It was as if the tape itself were addressing me, decades removed from the session. The whisper carried weight, patience, and a subtle insistence that I could not ignore. I pressed my hands over my ears briefly, telling myself it was imagination, the mind filling gaps in static and muffled speech. But when I removed them, the voices persisted. "You listen now. Remember, patient." The session continued. The child spoke softly about a small figure that appeared in corners, never fully formed, never fully absent. A presence that mirrored movement, that seemed to anticipate action, that whispered quietly in moments of stillness. The therapist noted these observations with care, documenting every detail as fact, acknowledging the unseen without fear, without judgment. I realized then that the voices were a reflection of the ward itself, its memory, its persistence, its awareness. The recordings were more than therapy notes. They were records of observation. The voices, faint and fleeting, were proof of an ongoing presence that had existed long before the tape, long after the child had left, and perhaps beyond the lifespan of the hospital itself. At one point, a low, almost inaudible chorus murmured in the background. "Observe, record, remain." The child whispered again. "They follow, they remember, even when I sleep." The therapist responded with calm authority. "That is why your account is vital. They persist because we observe, because we acknowledge. Memory is our tool. Attention is our safeguard." I leaned forward, my mind struggling to comprehend the subtle complexity of what I was hearing. The voices were not merely background noise. They were entities, persistent, patient, deliberate. They were aware of the session, aware of the child, aware of anyone who would later listen. I could feel them pressing against the edges of my consciousness, quiet, patient, inevitable. The tape hissed occasionally, static filling the pauses between words, but I could sense the rhythm, the subtle cadence, the slow, deliberate pattern that underpinned everything. Observation, memory, continuity, persistence. The voices, though faint, were unmistakable in their intent. They existed beyond the simple human interactions recorded on the tape. They were part of something larger, something patient and deliberate. The session concluded with the therapist's calm voice. "Session ends. Observations recorded. Presence acknowledged. Continue to monitor. Patient attention persists." Then the child whispered softly, almost to himself. "They never stop listening. Not ever. They remember me, and now they remember you too. The tape clicked into silence. I sat there frozen, letting the words settle into my mind. The room was quiet, but I felt the weight of their presence lingering, patient, and deliberate. The voices from the session, the shadows described by the child, the careful, unflinching documentation by the therapist, they had left an imprint, something that persisted long after the tape stopped. I realized that night that the ward was not just a place. It was a repository of attention, memory, observation, and I had become part of it simply by listening. The voices, patient and persistent, remained with me, whispering in the corners of thought, reminding me that some things do not end, that observation continues, that presence endures beyond the boundaries of time and comprehension. I carefully returned the tape to its box, reverently, as though handling something fragile and alive. I left the archive with the faintest echo of whispers following me, patient, deliberate, inevitable. Outside, the world felt ordinary, mundane, indifferent. Inside, the ward continued, and somewhere in its memory, the voices waited, observing, recording, persisting. And I knew, with a shiver that settled into my bones, that I would hear them again. I returned to the archive the following night, the tape player waiting like an old, familiar sentinel. I carried both previous cassettes in my hands, but it was the newest one, the final recording, that drew me in with an almost magnetic insistence. The box was unmarked, save for a faint scrawl, Session 12, Final Observation. I placed it in the player and pressed play, the soft hiss breaking the silence, and then nothing. Not silence exactly, but a stillness that seemed heavier than before, as if the room itself was listening. Then a voice emerged, the same calm, deliberate tone of the therapist unchanged. Session begins. Observation ongoing. Patient, room 4, record all interactions. The words were ordinary, professional, but something was off. This session, this recording, it carried a weight of continuity, an implication that time had not moved forward at all. And then the child's voice, soft, hesitant, familiar. I don't want to leave. I leaned in closer to the player. The words trembled on the tape, faint but clear, and I realized with a chill that they were not recounting a memory. They were happening again, right now. The therapist continued. You are safe here. Observation continues. They are present. Remember everything. I froze. The phrase struck me like ice in the chest. They are present, not in the past, not as a memory, present. As if whatever had been observed before, the whispers, the shadows, the patient attention, had never left. The session was ongoing. Faint murmurs drifted in the background, indistinct voices that were neither therapist nor child. I remembered them from the previous tape, the soft, fleeting, patient murmurs that seemed to belong to the walls themselves. Here, they were stronger, clearer, yet still impossible to fully discern. Do you hear them? The child whispered. They never leave, they are always here. Yes, the therapist replied, gentle, methodical. Observation persists, presence remains. Document their actions, record their patterns. You are part of the process now. The words wrapped around me like a slow tide. I felt the weight of unseen attention pressing into my chest. The child's whispers described shadows that lingered in corners, shapes that shifted when unobserved, figures that seemed to mirror movement with an eerie, patient precision. And now, in this final recording, it seemed the children, the ward, the session, and the voices were all bound in a single, persistent loop. The observation never ended. They are watching, the child said softly. Even when I close my eyes, even when the lights go out, they stay patient. The therapist's voice, calm and steady, reassured. Their patience is infinite, their attention deliberate. We document, we observe, we endure. Their presence is constant. I swallowed, a dry, rattling sound in the quiet archive. The recording, though gentle in tone, carried the weight of inevitability. I realized with a slow, creeping chill that the ward itself, the children's voices, the therapist's documentation, the murmuring presences, had never ceased. The session had never ended. The murmurs in the background became faintly more insistent, almost conversational, though their words remained elusive. I could hear fragments. Do not leave. Remember, observe. Still here, still waiting. Each fragment pressed against the edges of my awareness, subtle but impossible to ignore. There were no screams, no abrupt jolts, only the patient insistence of beings, or perhaps memory itself, present in the room, aware of observation, aware of those who listened. The child spoke again, hesitant, almost fearful. I thought it would end, but it doesn't. They said I have to stay. They said you have to listen. The therapist's reply was calm, almost soothing, though the words carried a weight I could not dismiss. Observation is continuous. Presence persists. Their patience extends beyond our understanding. You are safe but attentive. You are part of the record. I realized then that the voices, the therapist, the child, and the murmuring presences were not bound by conventional time. The session did not end because the room, the ward, the building itself did not allow it. Observation, recording, awareness, they were perpetual, a cycle that began long before the tapes existed and would continue long after I had left. A faint sound, like paper shuffling, drifted from the recording. The child whispered, "They move even when no one watches, even when I pretend to sleep. They move, patient, patient." The therapist acknowledged it softly. Documentation is crucial. Their actions are deliberate. Their presence is constant. We record, we endure. They remember. I pressed my hand to my chest. The slow, deliberate cadence of the voices, the patient, persistent whispers of entities that might not be human, created a creeping dread that had no resolution. There was no climax, no moment of terror to release the tension. Only a continuous, soft, undeniable pressure. The knowledge that observation never ceased, that presence lingered, that memory itself persisted within these walls. The child's whisper grew faint, trembling. Will it ever stop? The therapist's answer was steady, precise, almost comforting in its monotony. No, observation continues, presence persists. You are part of it now. Remember always. I could feel it then, the subtle, almost imperceptible pressure of unseen attention pressing into my mind. The recording, gentle in tone, insidious in effect, left me aware of forces that were patient, deliberate, and eternal. They were not angry. They were not violent. They simply existed, and they watched, always. The tape continued, faint murmurs in the background, shifting slightly, responding to the dialogue. The child described corners of the ward that seemed darker, edges of shadows that moved when unobserved, whispers that anticipated thought. The therapist recorded everything, meticulous, calm, professional. Their presence in the recording felt like an anchor, but even that anchor was part of the continuum. They had never left the room. I pressed my hands over my face, trying to comprehend the weight of what I was hearing. Not fear in the usual sense. This was something slower, more insidious. It was the knowledge that some things never end, some presences never leave, some observations continue indefinitely, patient, deliberate, and unavoidable. The final words of the tape were soft, almost a whisper, layered with the faint, persistent murmurs in the background. Observation continues, presence persists. You are part of the memory they never left, and now neither do you. The cassette clicked into silence. I sat in the archive, chest tight, the hairs on my arms standing on end. Outside, the world continued, ordinary and indifferent. Inside, the room was heavy with the memory of voices, the lingering patient attention of presences that did not depart, that never had departed, that persisted through time and tape and observation. I realized then, with a deep, cold understanding, that some sessions never end. Some presences never leave, and some observations, patient and deliberate, extend beyond comprehension, beyond human understanding, beyond the bounds of life and death itself. I carefully returned the tape to its box, reverently, aware that in doing so I was not truly closing the session. I was merely stepping back from it, leaving it to continue in its own patient, relentless way. And somewhere in that abandoned ward, in that children's room, the voices remained. They had never left. And now, in some quiet, unmeasurable way, neither had I. I had been walking past the old hospital for years, the building looming at the end of a cracked, overgrown street like a dark sentinel. Its windows were dark, boarded in some places, cracked in others. Most of the neighborhood avoided it, muttering about accidents, disappearances, strange suddenlies. But to me and the friends I had that night, it was an invitation. An abandoned surgical wing, its reputation half legend, half dare, promised the thrill we were chasing. We slipped through a rusted side door that hung slightly off its hinges. The air inside smelled of damp concrete, mildew, and something older, something metallic faintly lingering under the dust. Our footsteps echoed faintly as we moved, each step measured, careful, though our excitement buzzed just beneath the surface. I had my flashlight in hand, its beam cutting weakly through the darkness. The others carried small cameras, phones, and the usual urban explorer gear, enough to document without feeling entirely foolish. But as soon as we entered the corridor leading to the surgical wing, I felt the temperature drop. Not a shiver of wind, but something deeper, more patient, like the building itself was inhaling. The corridor ended at a pair of double doors, heavy in metal, faded green paint flacking off in long, jagged strips. A small sign read, "Operating Thutras authorized personnel only." Of course, that had never stopped anyone, especially not us. One of my friends pushed the door and it swung open with a slow, creaking protest. Inside, the surgical wing stretched before us, rows of operating tables standing silent and cold. Dust coated every surface, yet the faint gleam of the overhead lights made my stomach twist. Some of them were on flickering, humming softly, almost alive in the dim room. How could that be? No electricity had been on in this part of the hospital for decades. Yet above us, the lights shifted, swinging gently as though breathing, casting long, trembling shadows across the tables. I stepped forward, careful to avoid the broken tiles littering the floor. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant mixed with rot, a chemical memory of what had once taken place here. I imagined surgeons bending over their patients, instruments clinking, a sterile precision turning life into a series of calculated steps. And yet here, everything was frozen, the wing holding its breath, waiting. One of my friends whispered, "Do you see that? The lights they're on." I nodded, unable to take my eyes off them. They weren't fully bright, just enough to illuminate the room in a sickly, muted glow. Each operating table looked as though someone might return to it at any moment. Shadows pooled in corners, dark and patient, unmoving yet somehow aware. We moved slowly between the tables, each step careful, almost reverent. The tiles creaked underfoot. The overhead lights hummed softly, almost conversational. As though they were aware of our presence, acknowledging it with a subtle vibration that prickled my skin. I could feel my pulse quicken, though I tried to maintain calm. Then I saw it on the far table. One of the lights swung slightly more than the others. Not caused by wind, not by draft, but deliberate. A slow, patient sway as though someone, or something, was moving unseen above. I froze, holding my breath. My friends didn't seem to notice, but I could feel a pressure in the air, a quiet insistence that this was not just a building. It was a sentinel. It was alive in its own way, observing. I reached for my camera, trying to capture the eerie glow of the lights. The lens barely focused before the table itself seemed to shift in shadow. Nothing moved physically, but the shadows pooled differently, a subtle reorientation, a slow pulse that my mind recognized as attention. I swallowed hard. "This place, it's watching," I whispered. My own voice startled me, too loud, too sharp in the quiet room. One of my friends laughed softly, but it sounded strained. "It's just the building. Old lights, old wiring." I wanted to believe that. I tried, but every instinct in me screamed that we were not alone. The lights flickered again, a soft, rhythmic swing as if breathing with the room. I stepped closer to a table, my hand hovering over its surface. Dust shifted slightly, though no one had touched it. A faint, metallic scent wafted through the air, stronger than before, and I remembered the stories. surgeries that went wrong, whispers of patients who never left, a wing that had supposedly been abandoned in haste. We moved toward another row of tables. The lights above flickered in a pattern I couldn't quite read, off dim, swing, dimmer still. It wasn't random. I felt it in my chest, the patient, deliberate rhythm. I wanted to leave, to turn and run back to the corridor, but I couldn't. I was drawn forward, compelled to witness what this place held, as if the very room was breathing, alive with quiet memories that refused to rest. A cold draft blew across my neck. I turned sharply. Nothing. Just the humming, swinging lights and the shadows stretching across the floor. I could hear my friends' whispered murmurs, their cameras clicking softly, but the room's presence was louder, patient, waiting, observing. I moved to the final table at the end of the wing. The overhead light there swayed slowly, deliberately, as if acknowledging me personally. I reached my hand toward the switch, half expecting it to turn off the light completely. My fingers brushed the cold metal. It stayed on. I felt a pressure in the room, not threatening, not violent, just a patient insistence, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. One of my friends gasped softly. "Did you feel that?" "Yes," I whispered. "They're alive in some way, this wing, it's alive." The lights flickered again, softly, like a slow, deliberate exhale. Shadows pooled in the corners, edges shifting, but nothing moved physically. Still, I felt them. The echoes of surgeons long gone, the presence of patients long absent, the watchful attention of something patient and unyielding. We didn't speak after that. I simply moved from table to table, documenting, breathing, feeling the building's awareness brush against the edges of my mind. Every swing of the lights, every subtle flicker, was a heartbeat. Every shadow was a whisper of memory, patient and deliberate. By the time we left, the night outside felt different. Normal, mundane, and yet I could not shake the memory of those lights. Their slow, swinging rhythm haunted the spaces behind my eyes. The wing had watched us. It had acknowledged us. And in that patient, deliberate way that refused to hurry or shout, it had reminded me that some places never truly die. They endure, they wait, they remember. Even now, weeks later, I feel it whenever I close my eyes. The slow swing of operating lights in a room where no one should exist. Shadows pooling in corners, patient and deliberate, watching. And I know deep in my chest that if I returned, they would still be there. We lingered near the operating wing's entrance for a moment, catching our breath, trying to reconcile what we just witnessed. The lights, patient, deliberate, swinging ever so slightly, still hummed above us. Shadows stretched across the tables, and every tile beneath our feet felt alive with the memory of things long gone. But then I noticed something I hadn't seen before: the tools. On the stainless steel tables, arranged in careful, precise rows, lay scalpels, clamps, syringes, and scissors. Each instrument gleamed faintly in the dim light as if polished yesterday. There was no dust on them, no rust, no sign of decay. They were immaculate. They were ready, prepared, laid out in anticipation of some procedure that somehow had never been completed. I stepped closer, the chill of the room climbing my spine. My friends fanned out cautiously, whispering to each other, voices low, strained, almost reverent. "Look at this," one of them breathed. "Who? How?" I shook my head, unable to find words. There was no one here, no staff, no patients, not even a sound beyond our own measured footsteps and the faint hum of the operating lights. Yet every surface, every table, every tool whispered of imminent action, a preparation suspended in time. I reached out, careful not to touch, to see if perhaps these instruments had just been left behind, forgotten, overlooked. But the air felt deliberate, heavy. The faint scent of disinfectant, metallic and chemical, lingered in the spaces between us, stronger than before. It wasn't just the smell of old hospitals. It was recent, almost alive. "Why would they set everything up like this?" another friend whispered. I didn't answer. There was no explanation that made sense, not in terms of physics or history or reason. My pulse began to thrum in my ears. The surgical wing was not empty. It was paused, waiting, poised for action, patient, deliberate. I moved from table to table, my flashlight catching reflections in the sharp metal of the scalpels. Each reflection seemed almost like an eye flickering, observing me as I passed. My mind tried to rationalize. Perhaps someone had returned here recently, some urban explorer before us. But the precision of the layout, the deliberate spacing of instruments, suggested something beyond a casual visitor, something with intent. Then I noticed it, a small note on the edge of one table, yellowed with age but written in neat, careful handwriting. I squinted to read it. Ready for procedure. Maintain vigilance. Observe but do not interfere. No signature, no date, just the instruction. I felt a chill, deep and patient, slide down my spine. This was not just an abandoned surgical wing. Someone or something had ensured that the instruments remained exactly as they should be. That procedure, whatever it was, had not concluded. And the note suggested that the observation was ongoing, that it never ended. I stepped back, my breath shallow. The tools were not merely remnants of the past. They were part of a continuum. The wing, the instruments, the lights, they were all patient, deliberate, awaiting some unseen presence to complete what had begun. I moved toward a tray of syringes, their tips sharp and still glinting in the dim illumination. I imagined someone's hand hovering over them, fingers poised to inject, but no one appeared. My mind tried to dismiss the thought, logical, rational, human, but the room resisted. The lights swung ever so slightly, the shadows pooled in corners that should have been empty, and a faint, almost imperceptible murmur drifted from the far end of the wing. I froze. It was a soft, deliberate sound, like breathing or whispering, but not belonging to any of us. The instruments glimmered in the darkness, patient, precise, and somehow aware. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. "Yes," one of my friends replied, voice trembling. "It's like it's waiting for us to do something." I shook my head, trying to shake off the sensation, the slow, insidious pressure crawling over my skin. The tools were arranged for action, but not for us. They were ready for someone else, someone or something that might return at any moment, or perhaps they had never left. I walked past the central operating table. Its light above swayed slightly, a slow, deliberate rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. I imagined a surgeon bending over, instruments poised, the patient on the table lying silent, waiting. But the table was empty. The air hung heavy with the memory of countless procedures, of life and death frozen in anticipation. I glanced down the hallway at the doors leading to other theaters. The faint hum of the lights stretched into the darkness, patient, deliberate. The instruments on the other tables gleamed in silence, awaiting action, awaiting something that might never arrive. Yet the room insisted we see, remember, observe. One of my friends picked up a scalpel, just the handle, and immediately set it down, as if sensing the weight of what it meant. The air thickened, subtle but unmistakable, as though the instruments themselves were alive with expectation. The surgical wing was no longer a mere collection of abandoned rooms. It was a patient observer, keeping note of our presence, assessing, acknowledging. The shadows shifted at the edges of my vision. Not rapidly, not violently, just deliberate. A quiet, creeping awareness that I couldn't name, couldn't place. I felt its gaze on me as I moved from table to table, inspecting the trays, the scissors, the clamps. Each item glimmered, immaculate, precise. Ready, poised, waiting. I realized with a creeping chill that it wasn't fear I felt. It was comprehension. The wing was alive in its own way, not with flesh and blood, but with memory and attention. The instruments, the tables, the lights, they were the wing's eyes, its hands, its patient will. They were always prepared, always vigilant, and we had entered into their awareness. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, drifted from the far end of the room. A whisper, a soft shift of metal against metal. I couldn't tell. The lights swung slightly, the shadows deepened, and my pulse quickened despite my attempt at calm. This wasn't a building that could forget. It remembered every incision, every procedure, every patient who had ever lain on these tables. And now it remembered us. I stepped back, heart tight, and whispered almost to myself, Prepared for what? The instruments gleamed back at me, patient, deliberate. The wing hummed softly above, a slow, insistent rhythm that resonated in my chest. The note, the tools, the atmosphere, they all implied one thing. Some procedures never truly ended. Some wings never truly slept. Some presences lingered, patient and deliberate, waiting for observers, for participants, for witnesses. I didn't touch another instrument. We slowly retraced our steps toward the exit, careful not to disturb the perfect alignment of the tools. The lights swayed above, acknowledging us, patient and deliberate. Shadows pooled in corners, shifting ever so slightly as if following, remembering, recording. When we finally stepped back into the main corridor, leaving the surgical wing behind, the weight of the place lingered on me. The instruments, the lights, the air itself, they had observed. They had recorded. They had waited patiently, deliberately, and they would continue to do so long after we had left. Even now, when I close my eyes, I see the surgical tables, immaculate and poised. I hear the faint hum of the operating lights, patient and deliberate. And I know deep in my chest that some preparations are eternal. Some wings never abandon their purpose, and some presences never sleep. We had been in the surgical wing for a while by then, moving slowly, carefully, documenting everything we could. The lights above continued their steady, swinging rhythm, humming softly, patient and deliberate. The tools remained laid out perfectly, polished, gleaming as if some unseen hand had been tending to them moments ago. At first, it felt like a shared experience, a collective curiosity. But gradually, I realized, almost painfully, that the attention of the wing was no longer on the group. It had shifted. It was on me. I didn't notice it at first, not consciously. But the subtle change in the air, the way the shadows pooled closer to my steps, the faint metallic scent that seemed to intensify when I moved toward a table, it all began to feel personalized. I could almost feel the instruments watching me, waiting, responding to my presence. The scalpel on the nearest tray seemed to gleam brighter as I leaned closer. The clamps aligned themselves just a fraction differently in the corner of my vision, as if adjusting to my gaze. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was imagination, fatigue, stress, the thrill of exploration and the cold, stale air playing tricks on my mind. But the feeling was undeniable. The wing, the lights, the tables, they were aware of me. Not as an observer, not as a visitor, but as a participant. I moved cautiously toward a table at the far end of the room. The overhead light above it swayed ever so slightly, and for a moment I could swear it leaned toward me. Shadows pooled at my feet, stretching unnaturally, deepening. I tried to steady my breathing. The others were still behind me, murmuring to each other softly, but they seemed unaware of the shift. The patient, deliberate attention was mine alone. A cold draft brushed the back of my neck and I turned sharply. Nothing, just the faint hum of the lights, but the chill lingered, settling like a weight over my shoulders. My hands trembled slightly and I realized I had been unconsciously reaching toward one of the tables. The instruments lay there, poised, immaculate. They weren't ordinary objects anymore. They were tools of observation, memory, and somehow, anticipation. I whispered almost to myself, What do you want from me?" The room answered only with the faint, deliberate hum of the lights, the subtle shift of shadows, the soft gleam of metal reflecting in my flashlight beam. I could feel it in my chest, a slow pressure that wasn't threatening, not overtly, but insistent. Watch, wait, acknowledge, participate. I stepped closer to the central table, the one beneath the largest operating light. The instruments were arranged as if a surgeon had stepped away only moments ago, leaving everything precisely as it should be. I imagined the patient lying there, silent, waiting, and suddenly a thought struck me. A shiver crawling up my spine. I was the patient now. The idea wasn't forced. It wasn't an accident of imagination. I could feel it in the alignment of the instruments, the sway of the lights, the deliberate hush of the room. Every detail seemed to be arranged around me, anticipating my movements, my gaze, my presence. I tried to laugh it off, a soft, hollow sound. "It's just the room," I whispered. "Just the wing, just—" I stopped. Even as I spoke, I could feel the pressure increase, subtle but undeniable. The instruments gleamed sharper, the shadows deepened, the faint metallic scent thickened. The room was alive, and I was the focus. One of my friends called my name softly. I turned, and for a brief moment I felt almost relieved. But the attention didn't shift. It stayed on me. The wing wasn't aware of them. It was aware of me. And the thought sank like lead into my stomach. I was no longer merely an observer. I was being prepared for something. I reached out to touch the edge of the operating table. My fingers hovered above the cool metal surface, and the pressure in the air intensified. I could feel the patient, deliberate awareness of the room pressing in, patient and unyielding. My chest tightened. I realized I had been holding my breath for several moments without noticing. The table below the light was empty, and yet I imagined it filled with invisible weight, with silent presence, with expectation. The instruments at my side seemed to respond subtly to my gaze, tilting fractionally, aligning themselves as though anticipating my next movement. I wanted to step back, to leave, to escape, but some deep, irrational part of me urged forward. Observation, participation, acknowledgement, they were all intertwined, and I was drawn into the rhythm of the wing. I moved to another table, one closer to the far corner. The light above it swung slightly faster now, its faint hum resonating with my heartbeat. I could feel a pull, not physical, but something deeper, something cognitive, a patient insistence that I understand, that I witness, that I accept my role here. I imagined the surgical procedures that had once taken place in this wing. I imagined the surgeon's hands steady, the patient's body silent, the air thick with focus and chemical tang. And now, in this silence, I realized the procedures had never truly ended. The wing remembered, it observed, and tonight it had singled me out. I stepped closer to a tray of instruments, scalpels, forceps, clamps, syringes, arranged in immaculate order. I felt their weight without touching them, their intent pressing into my chest. Each one seemed to whisper a silent instruction: sit, watch, remain. You are expected. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. The lights swung above me, patient and deliberate. Shadows stretched toward me, dark pools of anticipation. The air seemed to thrum with attention, subtly vibrating against my skin. I realized I had become a fixture in the wing's memory, a participant in its eternal, suspended procedure. One of my friends whispered again, trying to coax me back. I could hear their voice, but it sounded distant, muffled, as if underwater. I turned slowly, trying to respond, but the pressure of the room kept me tethered, held my attention in place. The instruments gleamed at me in acknowledgement. The lights hummed, their slow swing insistent, and I knew with a deep, visceral certainty that leaving the wing was no longer a simple choice. I moved to the final table beneath the faintest glow of a flickering overhead light. The instruments there seemed sharper, more precise. The shadows pooled more deliberately around it, framing it, marking it as central. And in that moment I understood fully. The wing had been waiting for me. It had been patient, deliberate, observing, and now it had focused all its attention on me. I stepped closer, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The air thickened, the faint metallic scent stronger than ever. I imagined invisible hands guiding the instruments, arranging them in anticipation of some unseen act. I felt the slow pressure of observation, the deliberate awareness that was neither hostile nor kind, only insistent. The wing was alive, and it had acknowledged me. I whispered to myself, voice shaking, I'm the patient now. The light swung softly, shadows deepened, and the metallic scent lingered like a memory in the air. I could feel the alignment of the instruments, the hum of the lights, the subtle shifts of the shadows, all waiting, patient and deliberate, as if I had stepped into a scene that had never truly ended. I wanted to move back, to retreat, but every instinct, every rational thought, every urge to flee was countered by the weight of observation. The wing would not let me leave untouched. Not now, not ever. Even as we finally began to exit, stepping slowly back toward the main corridor, I could feel the instruments gaze, the lights swing, the patient insistence of the wing following me. My chest still tight, my mind still aware, I realized the truth. The surgical wing did not forget. It did not rest. And tonight it had prepared itself for me. Prepared, deliberate, patient. I never expected a quiet Thursday afternoon to turn into something I couldn't quite explain. The hospital had long since closed its doors to patients, shuttered and abandoned, but the administration had left behind an archive, a room stacked floor to ceiling with boxes of records. My job was simple: sort them, organize them, and prepare anything of value for eventual disposal. It should have been tedious, almost meditative work. But there was a weight to that room, a stillness that made the air thick with anticipation. The boxes were dusty, worn, and smelled faintly of paper that had aged too long. I lifted the first one carefully, mindful of the brittle edges, and set it on the table. Inside were folders, manila and faded, each labeled with a patient's name, a date of admission, and the department. Most of the files were standard, uneventful. Lab results, treatment notes, discharge summaries that followed the neat, procedural rhythm of any hospital record. But then I noticed something odd. As I flipped through the first folder, the discharge form at the back, the final page, the one that confirmed the patient had left, was blank, empty, nothing. No signature, no date, no note. My pen hovered for a moment and I checked the adjacent files. The pattern repeated. Several folders in succession had incomplete discharge forms. Patients who, on paper, should have been accounted for were, in fact, missing from the ledger of departures. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't fear in the conventional sense. Nothing had jumped out at me. But the quiet realization that the paper was hiding something, or perhaps forgetting, made the room feel heavier. The boxes pressed closer. The dim fluorescent light above flickered slightly, and the faint hum of the hospital's long silent ventilation system seemed to echo against the walls. I reached for another box, hesitating. The clerk before me had probably just pushed these aside, marked them archived, and moved on. I was supposed to do the same, but curiosity settled over me, patient and insistent. There was a story here, or many stories, buried beneath the dust and the smell of old paper. The next box was labeled Ward C, Pediatric Cases. My stomach tightened slightly. I opened it carefully, as if the folder itself might snap under the weight of the secrets inside. Patient files, neat and organized, each folder labeled in meticulous handwriting, except for the discharge forms, most of them incomplete. Some didn't even have dates of admission fully recorded. And yet every note in the treatment section detailed the child's stay. Medications, therapy sessions, even conversations with staff. It struck me as wrong. Every patient has a beginning and an end, admission and discharge, life and departure. But here the ending was missing. They had entered, existed, and vanished without closure. And the thought clung to my mind like a cold, wet cloth. What happened to these children after the records ended? I leaned back in my chair, running my hands over my face. The room was quiet, impossibly still, and I became aware of every small sound. The creak of the floorboards beneath my chair, the faint scratching of paper as I flipped folders, the distant hum of the ventilation system. Each sound amplified, drawn out, as if the room itself was listening, nodding my presence. One file in particular caught my eye. A girl about 8 years old admitted for a routine procedure. Her records were thorough, documenting every detail of her stay. Medications, vitals, even brief anecdotes from the nurses. But the discharge form at the end was blank. No signature, no date, no explanation. Only a note scribbled in the margin, almost imperceptible, still waiting. I stared at it, cold sweat forming at my temples. I flipped through the other folders in the box, expecting it to be a fluke. But the note, or a version of it, appeared in several other files. Still waiting, do not disturb, observe until complete. The handwriting varied slightly, but the message was clear. Something about these records, and perhaps the patients themselves, was unresolved. The air in the room seemed to thicken. My shoulders felt heavy, like the weight of the past pressing down through the ceiling tiles, through the walls, through the very floor. Each box I opened seemed to pulse with a faint energy, patient, deliberate, as if aware of my movements. I could hear the scratching of my pen against the folder, but it sounded distant, like an echo in a vast, empty chamber. I paused, trying to rationalize. Perhaps the clerks had simply failed to complete the paperwork. Human error, forgetfulness, bureaucracy. But the repetition, the precise nature of the notes, the way certain words recurred across different files, it didn't feel like error. It felt intentional, purposeful, as though someone or something had been keeping track of these patients even after the official record stopped. I lifted another folder, this one from an adult ward, and found the same pattern. Patients who had been admitted, treated, cared for, and then forgot. Some of the forms had dates that made no sense, jumping months or years between entries. Others were simply blank, silent, waiting for an ending that would never come. A faint noise made me start. A shuffle, a whisper of movement somewhere beyond the boxes. My heart thumped painfully in my chest. I glanced around the room. Empty. Only the boxes, stacked haphazardly, leaning slightly as if to hold the air in place. The hum of the lights above seemed to intensify for a moment, pulsing in rhythm with my own heartbeat. I told myself it was the wind through the cracked windows or the old building settling. But the sense of being observed refused to leave. Every time I reached for a box, every time I turned a folder, I felt a subtle shift, a pull, as if the room itself wanted me to see, to notice, to remember. I picked up another file and ran my fingers over the final page, the discharge form. Blank, empty. I could almost feel the weight of absence pressing through the paper. The names on the top of the folder seemed to stare back at me, patient and silent. Each patient a story frozen mid-sentence, waiting for someone to acknowledge their existence. A faint whisper seemed to drift along the rows of boxes. Not a word I could understand, but a sound that carried meaning all the same. I froze, listening. The boxes were silent. The air was still. And yet the feeling persisted. Someone or something was aware of me here, attentive, observant, waiting. I tried to focus on my work, to sort the folders and check off the list, but the room had changed. The boxes seemed closer now, the shadows longer, the air heavier. Each folder I touched seemed to pulse with some latent memory, a story half told, a patient half forgotten. I became aware of my own heartbeat echoing in my ears, mingling with the distant hum of the lights and the faint creak of floorboards far away. By the time I finished the last box on the table, my hands were trembling slightly. My notebook lay open, filled with observations, but it felt inadequate. The files, the notes, the blank discharge forms, they demanded more than documentation. They demanded acknowledgement, recognition, memory. I stood up slowly, stretching my back, and looked around the room. The boxes, patient and silent, seemed to watch me. Their presence pressed against my awareness, subtle but insistent. I felt the weight of countless untold stories pressing into the corners of the room. Forgotten patients, incomplete records, waiting, always waiting. I gathered my things and left the archive room, closing the door behind me. The hallway was dim, the fluorescent lights flickering. The building was quiet, yet the feeling lingered. A whisper at the edge of my perception, a subtle pressure against my mind, the knowledge that the records had not truly forgotten me. And I knew, as I walked down the empty corridor, that the patient's stories were not over. They were merely paused, waiting for someone to see them, someone to remember. And perhaps, I thought, that someone was me. I couldn't shake the feeling from the archive room. Even after I'd left, walking down the narrow hallway with the flickering fluorescent lights above, the silence pressed against me. My footsteps echoed, but not in a reassuring way. They bounced too sharply, too crisp, as though the building itself were listening, taking note. By the time I reached the stairwell, I knew I would have to return. Something about those boxes, the incomplete discharge forms, the whispered waiting, demanded attention. I hadn't finished with them. I couldn't. The next day I came back with gloves, a flashlight, and a notebook. The archive room smelled the same. Old paper, faint mildew, dust motes dancing in a shaft of sunlight that slanted through a cracked window. The boxes were where I had left them, stacked neatly against the walls. Yet as I stepped closer, a subtle unease settled over me. It was almost imperceptible, like the room itself had shifted while I was gone. I picked up the first box. It was heavy, as if weighted not just by paper but by expectation. I opened it carefully, flipping through folders I had already examined, and then I froze. Dates had changed. The discharge forms, blank the day before, now had entries, new dates, recorded in handwriting that seemed vaguely familiar. Observations were added in the margins, vitals noted, moods described, responses to medications, comments on progress. It was as if someone or something had been working while I wasn't there. I double-checked my own notebook. I hadn't written these updates. I had not even glanced at the pages since yesterday. I picked up another folder, my fingers trembling slightly. The same thing. New notes, detailed observations, precise measurements of things that didn't exist anymore, or perhaps never had existed at all. In one file, a child's height and weight were recorded for 3 consecutive days, though the patient had supposedly been discharged months ago. In another, a note detailed a conversation with an adult patient, words I could not recognize as my own, yet were written in the same elegant, clinical style I had seen throughout the archive. A shiver ran down my spine. I dropped the folder slightly but caught it before it fell to the floor. The sound of the paper settling seemed unnaturally loud, echoing off the walls like a whispered warning. I told myself it was a prank, perhaps left by someone before me, but the precision, the continuity across multiple folders made that impossible. This was ongoing, active. I sat at the table, turning over folder after folder, watching dates and observations appear before my eyes. The children's files were particularly unsettling. Each new entry was meticulous, noting moods, sleep patterns, dietary responses. One child, a girl of about 8, now had several new notes describing her interactions with staff that no longer existed, conversations with nurses long gone, even therapy exercises that were recorded in exact detail. And each file ended with a subtle note, still admitted. The words were small, almost timid, but insistent, still admitted, not discharged, not departed, not archived, still here. I tried to rationalize. Perhaps the hospital had set up some system to automatically update digital records, and these were residual printouts, somehow captured in the old files. But these were paper folders, physical paper. No technology here could write in the margins or change the forms. And the handwriting, it varied slightly but maintained a uniformity, a clinical elegance that no random printer could replicate. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window and I jumped, my notebook falling onto the floor. I bent down to pick it up, hands brushing the scattered folders on the table. One folder slipped beneath the edge of a box. I reached for it and felt something odd. The folder was slightly warmer than the others, a faint vibration running through it, as if the paper itself pulsed with life. I hesitated, then opened it. A single note had appeared overnight. No signature, no date, just a brief line. He observed the night shift. Record continues. My pulse quickened. I had no memory of writing this. I hadn't even been near this specific box yesterday. And yet the words were clear, readable, clinical, as though someone or something was documenting the archive as actively as I was attempting to observe it. I pulled back, breathing shallow, and glanced around the room. The boxes lined the walls, silent but somehow watchful. I could almost feel the weight of countless patients pressing from within them, the stories of those who had come and gone, or never left, nestling into the corners of the room. Each folder now seemed alive, buzzing faintly under my fingertips, a subtle insistence that I continue reading, continue noticing, continue remembering. The thought occurred to me that the hospital might not have been truly abandoned. Not entirely. Perhaps, somewhere, the records themselves were maintaining life. Perhaps the patients, their presence, their movements, their habits were being kept in the margins, in the meticulous updates appearing without human intervention. I continued, one by one, folder after folder, the same pattern. Observations updated themselves, vitals, medications, notes on interactions. One elderly patient had a note about a conversation with a nurse discussing the upcoming weather. The nurse did not exist. The patient had been discharged years ago. Yet the note was precise: temperature, barometric pressure, the patient's comment about the wind. I found myself whispering to the folders as if the act of speaking might somehow anchor me to reality. Who's updating you? Who is still here? My voice sounded foolish, almost childish, but the silence that followed was oppressive. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as though listening. Hours passed, though I could not tell for certain. My watch had stopped, a faint buzzing in the background keeping time that no longer belonged to me. Each folder, each note, each update felt deliberate, patient, eternal. And then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten further. New folders had appeared on the table, not from the boxes, not from anywhere I had seen. They were perfectly stacked, pristine, yet labeled with names I did not recognize. Dates of admission were current, as if the hospital were still open, still admitting patients somewhere beyond my perception. I opened the top folder with trembling hands. The first page was a form partially filled out with my own name listed as the admitting clerk. I blinked. No, that couldn't be right. I was the one sorting these files. I had not been admitted anywhere. And yet the observations continued, documenting me, noting my presence in the archive, the sound of my movements, the way I breathed and turned the pages. Still admitted. A cold sweat formed at the back of my neck. I wanted to close the folder, to shut the books, to leave the room entirely. But some part of me, the part that had first opened these boxes, refused. There was a story unfolding here, one that demanded witness, that demanded acknowledgement. I had become part of it, whether I wanted to or not. I spent what felt like hours watching the pages update themselves. Each note, each observation was precise, detailed, patient. I could almost feel the presence that maintained them. Silent, steady, an observer keeping the ledger, ensuring that no story ended, no life was forgotten. Even as I sat, exhausted, my mind weary, I could sense the constant rhythm of these updates, a heartbeat of the archive itself, timeless, persistent, and meticulous. When I finally gathered my things and left the room, the weight followed me. The folders, the boxes, the endless updates, they waited. And I knew, as I stepped into the empty corridor and felt the cold, lifeless air brush against my skin, that the hospital was still operating in some way beyond comprehension. Patients were still admitted, observed, documented, waiting. And perhaps one day I would be too. I was hired to inspect the building's security systems, routine work, or so I told myself. I walked through the empty hospital lobby, the polished tile reflecting my steps and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Everything felt ordinary at first, sterile in the way hospitals always do when they are mostly empty. But then I noticed the elevator. It was one of those older models, the kind that rattled faintly even when idle, the kind whose floors were numbered in small brass plates above the buttons. I pressed the button for the second floor. Routine, nothing unusual, and it began to move. I noticed the display flicker slightly as we ascended. Nothing too strange. But when we stopped, the indicator showed a floor I had never seen before, 5A. I frowned and pressed the button for the second floor again. The elevator moved, the same hum and vibration, and again the display skipped to 5A. My heart rate sped up slightly. I checked the panel. There was no 5A listed. Only floors 1 through 4, then the rooftop. I pressed every button, tested each floor, but the elevator seemed to have a mind of its own. Curiosity overcame caution. I pressed the button for 5A, the doors closed, and the elevator moved smoothly upward. When it stopped, I stepped out. The hallway was dimly lit, the lights flickering as though struggling to maintain power. The walls were painted in an institutional green, peeling slightly at the corners. It smelled faintly of disinfectant and something else, something sour and metallic that I couldn't place. The corridor stretched longer than it should have. There were doors on each side, identical, unmarked, except for one with a small brass plate that simply said, Room 7. I tried it. Locked. I knocked lightly, then harder, but nothing. Just the echo of my own knuckles on the door and a distant hum from the elevator behind me. I turned down the hall, flashlight in hand. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the floor, bending toward me when I moved, as though the walls themselves were leaning in. I could hear the faint buzz of electricity, the whisper of pipes behind the walls, but no other sound. No wind, no footsteps, nothing human. Yet I felt watched. I came to another door, this one slightly ajar. I pushed it open and found a room filled with old hospital beds, neatly made as though ready for patients. The sheets were crisp, the pillows stacked perfectly. And yet the room was abandoned. Dust lay on the floor, thin layers, but the beds looked untouched. On the far side, a small monitor blinked with life. Heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation. All normal readings, steady and rhythmic, though no patient lay there. I backed away, my flashlight beam shaking slightly. I told myself it was a test display, perhaps left running by maintenance. But the elevator doors downstairs still showed 5A, and the panel on the wall above the monitor blinked faintly, as though confirming my presence. I continued down the hallway. More doors, more rooms, each identical in their sterile perfection. Some had equipment left as though a shift had just ended, gloves on tables, charts scattered, but no signs of people. No sounds beyond the faint mechanical hum. One room contained a child-sized crib, empty, yet the monitor above it displayed a pulse, a tiny, steady heartbeat. I forced myself to step back, unwilling to admit how deeply unsettled I had become. I reached a staircase at the end of the corridor. Hesitant, I climbed, thinking it might lead back to a known floor. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, metal rail cold and slick under my fingers. At the top, I found another hallway, identical to the one below. No exit, no windows, only more doors, more monitors, more beds. I realized with a sinking feeling that the building might be larger than any plan could account for. That the elevator wasn't mistaken, it was correct. Floors existed here that were not on any blueprint I had ever seen. I returned to the elevator, hopping to descend and find reality again, pressing the buttons frantically for any familiar floor. The elevator responded, doors closing smoothly, but when it stopped, the display showed 6B, not 5A, not any floor I knew. 6B, I pressed the button for the lobby. Nothing. The elevator hummed as though ignoring me, then slowly moved upward again. Each floor had its own scent, its own subtle variation in light and air pressure. Some smelled of disinfectant and bleach, some of rusted metal, some of damp earth. I began to note them in my mind, trying to make sense of the pattern, but the floors had no pattern. They appeared when the elevator chose, and each room held objects that seemed both familiar and impossible. Surgical instruments polished as though still in use, beds made as though someone had just been discharged, charts filled with patient names I didn't recognize. A soft tapping echoed from a distant corner like fingernails against metal. I froze, shining the flashlight down the hall. The shadows moved, but nothing stepped into view. My breath came in shallow bursts. The tapping continued intermittently, always from somewhere I could not reach, always just beyond the edges of the light. I felt a compulsion to check the rooms to confirm that nothing or someone was there. Each door I opened revealed only emptiness. Yet monitors still blinked, charts still updated, beds still made, as though the hospital continued to operate in some parallel schedule, unseen by the rest of the world. I realized that these floors, these rooms, were not abandoned. They were hidden, preserved, waiting. I returned to the elevator again, pressing the button for the lobby repeatedly. The hum of the machinery changed slightly, lower now, vibrating through my chest. The numbers on the display flickered in rapid succession. 7C, 5D, 8A, before settling on 5A again. I hesitated, then pressed the button for 5A, stepping back as the doors opened to the familiar dim hallway. I knew instinctively that once you traveled to these floors, you were observed. Not watched in a conventional sense, no cameras, no humans, but recorded, noted, acknowledged. The walls themselves seemed to shift subtly, corridors extending and contracting, doors appearing and disappearing. And yet each floor, each room maintained a consistency. A patient could be admitted, monitored, even discharged, though only on the floors that didn't officially exist. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time became irrelevant as I explored, each room offering the same mixture of familiarity and impossibility. I had no memory of eating, no recollection of checking the time. The floors themselves were in control, opening and closing according to rules I could not comprehend. Finally, I returned to the lobby, shaken, exhausted, and sweating. The elevator now displayed only the known floors, as if nothing had happened. Yet I knew better. Somewhere in the hospital, floors that shouldn't exist continued to hum with life, waiting for the next visitor. I stepped out of the elevator, heart racing, and left the building. But the memory stayed. The numbers, the floors, the rooms with beds and monitors and pulsing heartbeats. I knew, somewhere deep down, that the hospital was still alive in its hidden floors, and that one day it might call me back. And I feared that when it did, I would return willingly. I told myself I wouldn't take the elevator again, that the unlisted floors, the impossible corridors, were a hallucination brought on by fatigue or stress. Yet something inside me, the same pull I had felt before, compelled me to step back in, to press a button I knew I shouldn't. The panel flickered under my fingers. One button remained unpressed, a small brass square with no label. No number, no letter, just a worn surface that seemed to hum faintly when I touched it. My pulse spiked. I wanted to back away, wanted to convince myself that curiosity was dangerous, that I could simply leave and forget. But I didn't. I pressed it. The doors closed, sealing me in. The hum of the elevator was different this time, lower, resonant, vibrating through the soles of my feet and up into my chest. The display showed no numbers, only darkness. The lights overhead flickered once, twice, then steadied. I gripped the railing, knuckles white, every muscle tense. The elevator moved, slowly, too slowly. Time seemed to stretch. The familiar sounds of the building, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant echo of air ducts vanished. I felt weightless, as though the elevator floated in a space outside the hospital entirely. My thoughts began to race. What if there was no floor at all? What if the elevator itself was taking me somewhere I could never leave? I swallowed hard. The air felt thick, heavier than before, and a faint metallic scent filled my nostrils. Then the doors opened. I stepped out cautiously, expecting a continuation of the dim, institutional hallways I had seen on the other floors. Instead, I was in a vast space, impossibly large. The ceiling was lost in shadows, stretching beyond the reach of my flashlight. The walls, if they existed, were far away, fading into darkness. The floor beneath my feet was smooth, cold, reflective, like polished stone or frozen water. My own reflection shimmered faintly, warped, not quite matching my movements. There was no sound beyond my own breathing. No hum of machinery, no distant footsteps, no flickering lights. Only the echo of each step as I moved forward. The light from my flashlight barely reached a few meters ahead, swallowed quickly by the black that seemed to stretch endlessly. I began walking. The vastness was disorienting. There were doorways, scattered and irregular, some standing alone, some forming small clusters. They led to the same rooms I had seen before, the patient beds, the monitors, the cribs, but all distorted, slightly off. Monitors blinked readings that made no sense. Pulse rates impossibly high or low, oxygen levels outside any human range. Beds were made, yet small movements suggested they were not empty. Shadows curled beneath them, fleeting shapes that vanished whenever I looked directly. One doorway caught my attention. Inside, a surgical tray had instruments arranged neatly, ready for use. Yet there was no patient, no surgeon. The trays glowed faintly in the dark, as though illuminated by some inner light. I stepped closer, drawn despite every instinct screaming to retreat. The instruments rattled softly as I approached, though the air was still. I froze, listening. Nothing. And yet I felt observed, recorded, measured. I tried to recall the building plans in my mind, the floors, the stairwells, the layouts. None of this existed. No blueprint could account for this space. I felt a cold certainty. I was somewhere entirely outside human understanding, a place created to mimic reality but governed by unknown rules. I moved on. Hallways stretched and contracted as I walked, rooms appearing and disappearing with no pattern. I glimpsed objects from my past, small personal items I did not recognize as mine, yet felt familiar, scattered among the beds and monitors. A stuffed toy, a folded jacket, a notebook filled with handwriting I could almost read but couldn't quite decipher. Each item made me shiver, not from fear alone, but from the eerie intimacy of the space. A soft murmur reached my ears. At first, I thought it was the echo of the elevator or the building itself. But then the words formed, clear but distorted, layered, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. "Why are you here?" I froze, my flashlight trembled in my hand. The voices weren't in a single location. They came from everywhere and nowhere, filling the vast space. I wanted to answer, to explain myself, but no words came. My throat tightened. The air seemed to thicken, pressing in on me, yet I could move freely. The paradox unsettled me. I found a room unlike the others. The door stood ajar, but inside was nothing but darkness, so complete it seemed to absorb the edges of my flashlight beam. I stepped inside. The floor beneath me shifted, subtly at first, then more noticeably, like water rippling under my feet. I stumbled, catching myself, heart pounding. Then a faint glow appeared in the center of the room. It was a chair. An ordinary wooden chair, but perfectly placed, facing the far wall, which was entirely blank. I approached it cautiously. As I neared, I noticed something written on the seat in faint, almost imperceptible letters. "Sit." I laughed nervously, the sound echoing unnaturally. I wanted to dismiss it as a trick of the light, a product of exhaustion. But the words seemed to pulse rhythmically as though breathing. I backed away. The chair remained unwavering. I took another step and the glow intensified, highlighting the outline of something or someone on the blank wall. A silhouette, faint, indistinct, shifting, as if it existed both in and out of the room. I stumbled backward, heart hammering. The voices returned, louder now, layered with whispers and sighs. Words I could not fully understand, yet they resonated in my mind, tugging at my memory, my sense of self. The space around me seemed alive, aware of my presence, reacting to my thoughts, my fears. I realized then that the elevator had taken me somewhere I could not escape through conventional means. It was a portal, a passage to a dimension parallel to the hospital, one that mimicked reality but twisted it. The floors, the rooms, the monitors, the beds, they were all part of this other place. I was not simply observing, I was participating, recorded and noted in a space outside human jurisdiction. I wandered for what felt like hours, though time had no meaning here. Rooms repeated, halls looped back on themselves, doors appeared where I knew there should be walls. I began marking my path mentally, leaving invisible breadcrumbs of thought, trying to map the impossible. But the hospital itself seemed to resist, corridors shifting subtly whenever I tried to remember their layout. Eventually, I returned to the elevator, or perhaps it returned to me. The doors opened silently, perfectly aligned with the floor I had entered. The unmarked button glowed faintly, pulsing in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I hesitated, knowing that pressing it again could take me even deeper, or perhaps release me back into the world above. I pressed it. The elevator hummed, smooth this time, the familiar sensation returning. I braced myself. When the doors opened, I stepped out into the lobby, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The world looked normal, sterile, perfectly ordinary. My pulse was still racing. My palms were slick with sweat. I glanced at the panel. Only the known floors were listed. No unmarked button, no impossible floor numbers. I left the building quickly, my footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. Outside, the night was calm, rain pattering softly against the pavement. The hospital loomed behind me, silent, ordinary, unchanged. And yet I knew the truth. Somewhere above, below, and beyond the floors that existed only in secret, the hospital continued to operate in a realm I could not comprehend. And one day I feared it would call me back.